Irish Breakdown. Welcome back, fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. We're going to talk Notre Dame Syracuse today. We're going to talk Tommy Rees. We're going to talk Al Goldenrod. We got lots of cool stuff to talk about today. I can't wait for another show. Notre Dame is now 3 days away from taking on the 16th ranked Syracuse Orange in what is a huge game, Ryan, a huge game before they then take on Clemson a week later. You know, we talked a lot about Syracuse being a trap game during the summer, because you and I both thought they had a really good run game and a really good defense. And lo and behold, they have a really good run game and a really good defense. Some other parts of their team have improved from what they were last year, which is why Syracuse has already topped their win total from last season. They're already bowl eligible with still a week left in the month of October. Dino Babers doing a great job of really salvaging his tenure there at Syracuse. There was some thought that if they don't turn things around now, he could really be on the hot seat. And boy, have they turned things around this season. It's going to be a big, big test for Notre Dame. And today, Ryan, we're going to talk about the matchup, the statistical matchup between Notre Dame and Syracuse, and then some of the personnel matchups that could have a big impact on those statistical matchups. But first, Ryan, I want to talk a little bit about a couple things that we heard yesterday and last night in the Notre Dame press conferences. It's a comment from Tommy Rees and a comment from Al Golden that I want to kind of speak to a little bit, Ryan, because there are things that you and I were talking about. And so we'll talk about those just here for a little bit, and then we'll jump into the statistical matchup. And then, of course, we will have our mailbag. So leave those mailbag questions in there, obviously, is right now, and we'll get to those. And Super Chats obviously get moved to the top of the line as best we can. But, Ryan, I want to talk about a couple things that were brought up in last night's press conference. And somebody asked about the lack of big plays in the run game. Mm-hmm. And then talked about how is wide receiver blocking the issue. And you know, the question spoke to a reality of this Notre Dame rushing attack, which is, I mean, when you look at the lack of big plays and the lack of really quarterback production in the run game since Tyler Buckner's gotten hurt, not that Drew Pine, I mean, he's not losing a bunch of sack yards. He's ripped off a couple scrambles, right? He had I think like a 21-yard scramble, I believe, against UNLV this weekend, but you're not getting that high volume of production. And yet over the last 4 games, Notre Dame is averaging, I believe, a little over 200 yards a game rushing. So you look at that and you think, you know, they're doing that with really no big plays in the run game. I mean, there's no 50, 60-yard runs. I think the longest run of the season this year so far, Ryan, is like in the 30s, correct? I believe is one of the longest runs that Notre Dame has had this year. They don't even really rip off a lot of 20-yard runs, to be honest with you. They've had a couple here and there. No, actually, you had the 46-yard gain at the end of the BYU game. But that was kind of after you had kind of worn BYU down a little bit. You had the long run from Audric Estime. The longest run for Logan Diggs is 33, also from the BYU game. Longest run for Chris Tyree is only 19 yards. So there's clearly some issues with big plays. And Tommy Rees talked about it, and he says, well, you know, it's a lot of different things, and it's complicated, and there's more to it than just receiver blocking. I would say the receiver blocking is an issue, but I think there's bigger issues, Ryan, and I think it goes to, you want to talk about the lack of big plays. It's really not that complicated at all, to be honest with you. It's the fact that what Marcus Freeman said you have to force teams to do, Notre Dame is not doing. And what he said is you have to force teams to defend 53 1/3, which is the width of a football field. The reality is neither the Notre Dame run game nor the Notre Dame pass game do anything to create any threat to the perimeter. And this isn't a downfield perimeter. We're talking about they do nothing schematically. They don't run RPOs. They don't run bubble screens. They don't run anything that makes you really defend the width of the field. That combined with the fact they condense their formations and everything is kind of right up the middle, and there's nothing that forces any kind of width run game scheme-wise to create any running lanes, those are the reasons that they don't have long runs. So I would argue that the lack of long runs has a lot more to do with how the offense is constructed and called than it has to do with anything related to blocking, reads, downfield blocking, things along those lines. Maybe a run here or there could have been longer with that. Sure, no doubt. We were very critical of the run blocking against BYU, for example. But this goes much deeper than that specific stuff, and it has more to do with just the foundation of what the offense is.
I mean, Brian, you said it perfectly. I mean, I even think, look, when people, because every week that you pop on a game and it's like, oh, just like an inside zone bust through the first and second level, and then there's just nobody home, right? And they just take it for 6. And this is talking about like the landscape of college football. Your thought process needs to go, why is that happening, right? Why is the third level vacated? It's because you have to now have support to defend the perimeter. I mean, the game and how it's played today, you see so much stretch, outside zone, bubble screens, working from the slot, RPO action. There's so many things that pull players from the middle to have to overcompensate to the outside. Notre Dame doesn't do that. And it's not even that they don't do it successfully. It's literally they don't do it. I mean, we were losing our minds last game because they did two RPOs in a football game. Like, it's just, we're losing our minds.
Now, in fairness, they did call a couple more, but
Sure.
they didn't throw them, but it wasn't enough to where it's going to impact the defense at all, Ryan, to your point.
Exactly. And I had a conversation with someone, it was either last night or this morning. Days blur together now. It's awful. As I get older, days are just blurring more and more together. But someone asked me, and it was the same thing, Brian. It was an outside perspective, and they said, Notre Dame just looks like they don't have much speed. And I'm like, well, Chris Tyree in the 2020 cycle was probably the fastest kid that came out of high school football, right? And you just mentioned it, a 19-yard run on the season. And I quickly go to the fact of like, why, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, right? Chris Tyree has been relegated to an A-gap duo runner. Why is he not a guy that's getting some opportunities in buck sweep, stretches, outside zone, jets, even occasionally? I would be okay with. There's just you're not using the players that have the speed and the dynamic ability necessary to threaten the corner. And with if there's no threat, if I'm a defense that plays a lot of too high safeties, right, too high alignments, why would I vacate that and roll players down to being a slot defender if there's no threat of anything ever getting to the slots? Like, at that point, right? It's a numbers game at that department. So I think it's telling that two running backs that had the longest runs of the season out of the top 3 backs are Audric Estime and Logan Diggs, who are your 2 slowest running backs. And they're not slow in terms of like in a vacuum, right, but compared to a 4-3 Chris Tyree, they're slower backs, right? So again, it's just the emphasis has not been there. And, first and foremost of the comments, it ticked me off because me and Brian didn't even talk about it. And before the podcast, he's like, what did you think? And that was the first thing we talked about, man. The first thing I brought up was the fact of like, one, perimeter blocking has not been good. If we're being completely honest, it has not been good. And 2, you're also not helping your offense. You are a part of the issue. And I agree that there's layers to why it hasn't been successful, but at a point, and we've talked about this so much, coaches need to be real with themselves. You need to look at yourself in the mirror and saying, why is this happening? Why is this? Am I the problem? Am I an issue? And my response would be, you are part of the issue. You are a big part of the issue. So there has to be some self-evaluation, Brian. I mean, we're getting to the point where we are now in game, what is this? They're 4-3. So we're going to game 8. Yeah. And we're still asking ourselves, is this going to happen? And I am getting less and less convinced that it's going to happen, if I'm being honest.
Well, and that's the frustrating thing, is because it's not hard to see, and you talked about there's this constant discussion. We hear it from Notre Dame media, national media, fans, everybody, your buddy. Notre Dame doesn't have speed. We talked about Chris Tyree. Lorenzo Styles is on the freaks list for Bruce Feldman because of his crazy numbers and his testing numbers and his miles per hour numbers on the GPS, right? Well, Braden Lindsey, we all know, he's at least fast. You can question a lot of things, but he's fast. I think Tobias Merriweather and his limited opportunities have shown he can get over top of a defense. So, but it's how you use that speed that makes it not fast. When Chris Tyree is just running inside A-gap runs nonstop with no threat of cutbacks or things like that, or no, made this play he's running A-gap, but the next play he's running outside, and the next play he's running a wheel route, things like that, then guess what? He's not going to be an effective big play guy. So you've got to, again, we say this all the time. It's about take your talent and then use it correctly. Use it to play. Tommy Rees talked about this year. He talks about, hey, we work the talent of our players into the system. It's player driven. That's lip service, because the offense you're running is not geared towards utilizing the players that you have. Mm-hmm. It's not. It looks a lot like the offense you had a couple years ago, which was a very boring, dull offense in 2020. You're just throwing it up the Javon McKinley and stuff like that. You're not using that. Well, those are bigger receivers. And so it is frustrating to see that, but you can't just keep everything here in a box and then wonder why there's always just one more guy that you can block in the run game. Start running RPOs effectively. Start beating teams with screens. Start doing those kind of things, and all of a sudden, you're going to see those. I mean, look, Jack Cohn had a long touchdown run last year against North Carolina, right?
Yep.
What did Notre Dame do that game? They hit multiple RPOs in that game. They hit multiple crossing routes in that game. They had North Carolina chasing, which left this huge hole for a quarterback that ran what did he run? Like a 5 flat at the combine?
It was like 4.9 something. Yeah, right? It was close.
Run like 20-plus yards for a touchdown. Jack Cohn had a longer run last year for a touchdown than Chris Tyree has and through 7 games in 2022. And you're going to tell me it's a talent or a speed problem. All right? And so that's the frustrating thing. And that was kind of discouraging to me because it felt like, that's kind of, what we've seen for 7 games. And it didn't sound like that he kind of got it. Like somebody asked on the board, like, how does Tommy Rees not see it? And my whole thing was, he sees it, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I'll say it again. You can see someone sick. We all identify that this person is sick. We all see the symptoms of the sickness. Yep. But can you identify what the sickness is or where it came from? If you can't do that, you can't fix it. You can't medicate it if you don't know what is causing it. Right. And that's the problem. It's I think that there's still a thought of, well, it's not me, it's not the game plan, it's not this, it's them, or it's this other thing. It's Drew not doing this or so-and-so not doing that. And that's just not how it works. And you want to have bigger run plays, spread the field out formationally and schematically. And I'm not even talking about just going 11 personnel. Do it out of 12 personnel. Start putting Michael Mayer backside more. Start putting him outside more. Start going 3-by-1 with Michael Mayer in the slot and Mitchell Evans attached so you can still have that backside edge secured if you want to run the football in a certain way. Or if you want to run duo, you still have the front side edge secured. There's plenty of things you can do out of 12 personnel that can also create some of those opportunities. So until that gets addressed, Ryan, we're going to be kind of having the same problems.
Well, and Brian, I would say this, right? We've talked about this process also, being process-driven versus being results-driven, right? And I do think there's probably some part of Tommy Rees that, and this is flawed thinking. I'm not like giving him a pass on this, but I'm sure there's part of him that's saying like, nope, I trust my process. We're going to keep doing what we're doing, and then eventually it'll kind of break through the wall. But at the end of the day, and I've talked about this on Twitter a ton, it's result. Yes, the process is more important than the results. But if you're not getting results, then you need to fix your process, right? Your process is flawed in that instance, right? And I think that's what we're seeing is that there's a flawed process that isn't arriving at a result, and we're not having enough self-awareness to say, hey, my process is flawed to begin with. I need to reevaluate and change that process. That's what kind of the end result is. And again, we've harped on Tommy Rees a ton. We've harped on him. We've given compliments, because I do think he's a smart guy. There's no question. Like, this has nothing to do with football intelligence. I think there's just some lack of self-evaluation here. I think there's a lack of understanding of what is going to make you successful. I truly do. I don't think that this is just something where Tommy Rees isn't smart enough to understand a problem and fix it. I just think that you only see a problem if you believe that there is a problem that exists. And I just don't think that that he believes there's a problem that exists right now, which is frustrating.
There was another comment that was made about Al Golden, and he talked a lot about Syracuse in his press conference, and I thought you can kind of tell they got a pretty good handle on who Syracuse is, right? And how he kind of went on this long tangent of all the different things Sean Tucker does. And I'm like, yep, that's what makes this kid really hard to defend, as we'll talk about during today's show. But one of the things he said at the end, Ryan, I thought kind of like, okay, now we understand why this team keeps making these mental mistakes and giving up big plays. And I want to read the direct quote because I want to get it spot on correct. I don't want to kind of miss this, Ryan. So I'm going to actually read the direct quote that he gave. And it was like kind of like a throwaway comment at the end. And honestly, I didn't even pick up on it at first until I was transcribing it last night for an article. And here's what he said. He was talking about, somebody asked him about Syracuse and Clemson, and he brought it back to where I thought, it was a good comment from a big picture standpoint, but there's one part of it that I didn't like. He was trying to say, look, I'm not worried about Syracuse and Clemson, and we're just focused on getting better today. And so he said something. He said, right now it's really about winning today, doing everything we can to prepare, have urgency in the way we prepare, know that we don't have time to redo a play because someone didn't know what they were doing, and hopefully carry that into a game. Now, he had a lot of things he was talking about yesterday, and he talked about how he felt the install yesterday was really good, how he really felt like they're on a good grasp, which is 2 practices in now, right? Because they'll have a practice either on Sunday or Monday plus Tuesday, and they don't practice on Sunday and Monday. They'll do one or the other. I would assume this week, since they were at home, they practice on Sunday night.
Right.
Monday off means practice yesterday, so that was good. But that last comment, Ryan, kind of caught me off guard a little bit, because he was basically admitting that, we're out here trying to get as many plays run as possible and scheme, and we don't have time to redo a play because you got something wrong. And that kind of bothered me a little bit. And it was like that explains why this team because here's what we can say about this Notre Dame defense. For 80% of plays in every game they've played this year, at least 80, they have been dominant. Dominant. Like really good, at times as good as any Notre Dame defense we've seen since 2018. Reason why? This is the best cover secondary we've seen since 2018. Would you agree with that? Right?
Yes.
Especially since Benjamin Morrison's been inserted into the lineup as a starter, but even against Ohio State, he played a good amount of football. This secondary is the best to just flat out just go out and cover people, right? Which is why you don't see them get beat a lot down the field, and when it has, it's usually been blown assignments, blown coverages. Yes. But then there's the other 10 to 20%, depending on the game. And those plays are so bad that it's the things that allow this defense to kind of rank where they do. And as we'll dive into the numbers, but this team, when they're on, is so much better than what their statistics show. And it says a lot about why they're not able to make red zone stops, and they're giving up the big plays when they shouldn't be giving up big plays, because you're so focused on the scheme and what you're doing schematically that you've kind of lost sight of. This is still about teaching kids how to do things at a very high level fundamentally. And that's kind of what I'm a big believer that if I got to run something 5 times in a row to get it right, and this is what I think makes Harry Hiestand a great offensive line coach. This is you've seen it now firsthand. If he's got to run a play 10 times in a row for somebody to get it right, then that's what we're going to do, because I know when we're done that they're going to know how to run that play really, really well. When we get 3rd and 1, I know we can run that play because we rep the heck out of it during practice. And that kind of concerned me a little bit. It shows that he does have a lot of that NFL mentality in him, which is much more scheme-driven than how to play the game-driven.
Right. We talk about that a ton, right? College is much more, I'm going to teach you, right? Like, I'm a teacher at heart. That's kind of the progression that happens. NFL, you expect 22 to 24-year-old kids to be able to come to you and be able to do the little things, right? Do the basics, do that, and then I will put you in my scheme, and then I will accentuate the strengths that you have. But I don't have time to really improve strengths or turn weaknesses into strengths on the NFL level. If a guy's struggling that bad, you cut him, and you find another one, right? Like that's just kind of the NFL mentality. College football, you're building this roster to hopefully have these kids for 4 to 5 years, and now with COVID, even 6 years in some instances, right? So you are really developing and teaching at a much higher rate, which I think that, and I agree with you, and we talked about this before we started, that I think that there is a little bit of Al Golden right now that's being very NFL driven, very scheme driven versus player driven. And I think that that's a perfect example. It's like the saying, right, Brian? And I've always really kind of parlayed to this, and just from my coaching background, is that I would rather be really good at a few things than average to below average at a lot of things, right? Like that right now, I think that there's just too much of across the board not doing things well enough. Attention to detail, Those things are being missed, which is why against North Carolina, you see a couple blown coverages because you're not coached up well enough on to either get the call or play the coverage correctly. So those things I think are kind of falling through the cracks a little bit because there's more of an attention of detail of, hey, I need to run this coverage X amount of times in practice. I don't have time to add 2 more times to the docket if we run it incorrectly. So I do think that there's some inconsistency in that area, much more scheme driven than player driven. It does seem by that comment.
So Ryan, we agree on that. So what I want to do next is I want to dive into this matchup between Notre Dame and Syracuse, because I do think it's a very, very fascinating matchup. I think there's a lot about this matchup that you look at and say, man, I really think that Notre Dame's got a shot to win this game when I look at certain things. And then you look at other aspects and you're like, yeah, this is going to be this is going to be a rough game, because in a lot of ways, this is one of those games where it's just going to come down to, I've had people ask me, what's your prediction for Saturday? I said, I really haven't made one yet because I'm still working through the film and all those different types of things. I said, but the thing about it is, though, it just depends on which version of Notre Dame shows up. And that's what makes this particular part of the matchup challenging, because when you look at some of these numbers, there's going to be games you're like, well, if that pass offense shows up, then Notre Dame's going to be okay. But if that pass offense shows up, they're going to be in trouble. If this defense shows up, then they're going to have a rough day. If this defense shows up, Syracuse is going to have trouble scoring. So those are the things you look at. I mean, look, Notre Dame gave up as many points to UNLV and as they did Ohio State. They gave up more points to Marshall. Well, not technically, because they gave up 19, but they gave up almost as many points to Marshall and Cal as they did Ohio State. They gave up almost as many points to BYU as they did Ohio State, because every game is the same way. Lots of really good football mixed in with about 5 or 6, like, what was that type of plays? And so it really makes this a fascinating matchup. So I want to dive right into it, Ryan, and let's talk about sort of the run game versus run defense, all those type of matchups between Notre Dame and Syracuse. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting to look at the numbers. As I was putting this together yesterday and today and really diving into the stats, you really start to see kind of, okay, this matchup's going to be really interesting because Syracuse is really good at certain things. So let's just jump right into it, Ryan. And we're going to begin with the Notre Dame rushing offense against the Syracuse rush defense. Now, we were talking before, Ryan, and I don't know if we said this during the show, but it's really interesting to see how good Notre Dame's rush offense has been recently when you consider that they don't have the big plays. Yeah. And, you look at they're a tale of two teams. At times, like early in the season, their rush offense was not good. You talking about a team, Ryan, that in the first 3 games of the season averaged, I think it was 100 and let's see here. You averaged 117.7 yards per game. In the last 4 games, however, even with the Stanford performance in view, Notre Dame has averaged 223.5 yards per game in the last 4 games. They've gone over 200 yards 3 times. And so you look at it and say, well, who is Notre Dame? And you'd like to say, well, they're the team that's rushing for 203 last 4 games. And then you say, yeah, but what happened against Stanford? And that's the thing that makes this really difficult to break down, because it just, you can't really say that because of that one performance. And then you look at Syracuse, and their rush defense has been pretty good this year, Ryan, statistically. 137 yards to Louisville, 97 yards to Connecticut, 61 yards to Purdue, 149 yards to Virginia, 31 yards to Wagner, and then 95 yards to NC State, right? Those are all pretty good numbers, Ryan. And then there's last week. And even when Clemson couldn't throw the ball last week, they still ripped Syracuse up and rushed for 293 yards. So you have to ask yourself, okay, as I look at Clemson's schedule, right? I mean, if you look at Syracuse's schedule and you look at the teams they played, Louisville this year so far ranks 32nd in the country in rushing. It's pretty good, right? And they did a really good job keeping them in check. And for the most part, since then, Louisville's been pretty good. Connecticut's ranks 39th in the nation in rushing offense. So obviously they're pretty good. Then you've got Purdue and Virginia ranked low. Virginia is 91st. Purdue is 96th. And then you have NC State, who's 90th. So they've played. You can't really do the whole, well, it's misleading because they beat up a bunch of bad teams that don't run the football that well, because they shut down Louisville and UConn, who both run the football pretty well. So you kind of ask yourself, okay, which version of Syracuse are you going to get? Was last week an anomaly, or did Clemson kind of finally figure something out that NC State, I thought, could have if they had more of a pass attack to take some of the pressure off the run game? Because I think that's something that hurt them. But obviously this is going to be another big test for the Syracuse defense. On paper, Ryan, obviously Syracuse, I think, gets the advantage overall, slight advantage overall to me when you look at the on-paper matchup. But I think that if you look at the last really 4 games in view, I think you kind of got to come close to making this an even call, Ryan, when you look at the numbers, because the last 4 games, Notre Dame has been much more effective running the football. And I think the other thing, too, is Notre Dame has done a very good job, which talk about turning things around. Think of the tackles for loss and the sacks, how they were so terrible at that last year. But even more so how they weren't even good at that the first 2 games. They were giving up negatives and sacks. And as you're going to see in the pass game offense, too, the pass game statistic, too, they're very good at limiting sacks, and they have been the last 4 games. So it even speaks even more to then shouldn't the yards per attempt be higher? Because you're not giving up a lot of negatives. But that speaks to the lack of big games, Ryan. So it's a very intriguing matchup. I'm curious to get your thoughts on just the specifics of it. I kind of broke down the numbers, kind of have you dive a little bit into the specifics of this matchup.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the game against Clemson, was very telling for what Syracuse is on paper as a rush defense, Brian, because like when you look at them, right, from a player-to-player standpoint, you wouldn't think they would be a great rushing defense because you have, 5'11", 266, you got 6'4", 268 up front, you got 6'5", 219 up front, and then you have 2 linebackers that are really good football players, but I mean, Michael Jones is listed at 6'1". I have an official measurement on him. I'm just saying that he's lower than 6 foot, if we're being completely honest, right? So he's 5'11" and some change, 220-something pounds. And Marlo Wax, who's listed at 6'1", 232, is the big linebacker, right? So they don't have the biggest front 6 to 7 that you will find in college football. And I think when you look at them on paper, you would be like, oh, they're not going to be a great rushing defense. But what they do really well is they create a lot of movement. They do create some tackle for loss numbers, the decent number there at 44. And I think that that's kind of their biggest plus as a defensive unit is the fact that they have some game speed and they are able to create movement and create a lot of penetration into the backfield and make some of those plays. But in that style, though, Brian, in my opinion, why you're seeing a little bit of volatility with them as far as last week compared to what they have been is when you are that attack style defense and you are a little bit undersized, if you have a missed assignments or you hit the wrong gap or you do these types of things, then at the point of attack, you're going to be outmanned if you make a mistake, right? So I think that in this type of defense, while you're aggressive and you're quick, there is a smaller margin for error because you don't have the big hosses up front to be that great rush defense consistently on a week-to-week basis. So I think last week you just saw a little bit of an indicator like, hey, when Clemson was able to figure it out, especially down the stretch, they're able to kind of counteract that speed that Clemson has, that Syracuse has, and they're able to beat them man-to-man because they have bigger guys and more powerful players than them. And I think that that's a similar formula for Notre Dame is that you have to understand that movement's going to come, and you have to be very communicate very well this week because you're able to get them into bad positioning and just overwhelm them at the point of attack with your size and your physicality. I think that's the recipe for success against this team. So in this matchup, on paper, I agree with you that the lead would go to Clemson just based upon the numbers. Mm-hmm. But I think when we practically look at it with what Notre Dame is and what Syracuse has defensively, Notre Dame has a chance to have a clear advantage in this game. But at the end of the story is, based upon what we've seen, Syracuse has been more consistent in this department than what Notre Dame has been as a rush offense. So you're going to have to see what happens on Saturday. But I do think that Notre Dame has the chance to have this an advantage. But I agree with you right now. You can't count it as an advantage until you see Notre Dame answer the bell, kind of like what Clemson did last week.
And that's the key, consistency. Yep. Consistently, Syracuse has been good. They've had one bad game. right? And right now, it's kind of like what we talk about the Notre Dame offense. Right now, the North Carolina game is the anomaly. It's the one game that's different than all the others. We'd like to think that Notre Dame is capable of being that more consistently, but until they actually show that they can do it more consistently, you have to be able to look at it and say exactly what it was. It was the anomaly. And so that's kind of what we don't know, Ryan. Practically speaking, can Notre Dame run the ball in Syracuse? Sure. But also, I would say, just as practically speaking, they're not going to do it, in my opinion, doing exactly what they've done against recent teams. Because one thing that here's where I think it helps Syracuse, Ryan. They can cover on the perimeter. And when you can cover on the perimeter, it allows you to use more resources when you need to play the run. And I think that's something that helped them too. They can just say, hey, we're going to take Deuce and we're going to take Garrett and we're going to lock up their outside receivers. And then we're going to have, one safety kind of spying Michael Mayer. And then everybody else is going to, key the run game. Because once you see Notre Dame's offensive line blocking down, there's a difference. You can tell the difference when you're watching film of when Notre Dame is running the ball and when they're running play action. And most teams are. That's what makes RPO so challenging, because when you add RPOs in there, you're not quite sure, okay, are they going to throw the ball here? The safeties can't be as downhill. But right now, when you're playing Notre Dame and you see that guard pull or you see a down block and you see them drive blocking, okay, get downhill, cover up my gap, fit against the backers because they're not throwing the football. Now, hopefully they kind of pull some of that stuff out a little bit this week and do a little bit more of that. But I thought Clemson had a really nice inside-out mix last week. They used both of their backs, had success last week. Obviously, Will Shipley had the bigger game, but Muta also had, I think, close to 100 yards, or I think he went over 90 in that game, if I remember correctly. So they both ran the ball really effectively. I think you can and I think what Clemson did too, is Clemson was smart. Even though they were down, they didn't panic play calling wise. Brandon Streeter didn't panic when they were down 21-10. And yes, DJ made some mistakes and obviously got picked off what 2 times, right? In that game? Three times.
Yeah.
But what you saw from them was they said, okay, they made the move, but they didn't panic. And so what they did is they just went out and said, okay, we're going to do what we do. And they kept grinding away. And then lo and behold, what happens in the second half, especially the fourth quarter, they just wore Syracuse down and put 17 points on the board on them. And a lot of it had to do with just the fact that they just wore them out. And I think that was obviously a big part of that game, Ryan, was just if your defense can keep you in the game, meaning they don't give up a lot of points, then what you'll find is late in the game is you'll have a chance to really wear this defense down. Because to your point, they aren't big. They are a small team. They are a team that you can wear out. And if Notre Dame can do that, then I do think that if this becomes a fourth quarter game, I feel good about Notre Dame being able to put it away if they can make it a 4-quarter game. If you're playing from behind, then you get in a little bit more of a rough spot. Right. So I do think this is definitely a game you want to establish the run, Ryan. There's no doubt about it. You want to lean on this Syracuse team. I do think that this is one of those games. I mean, you always want to, if you can hit a home run. But this is one of those games where I wouldn't mind early on just a couple 7-8 play drives just to get a more pounding on that undersized Syracuse defense. And then fourth quarter, you put them away. I think that's a recipe for success. But it's going to require that you bring a little bit more to the table than just the limited package of scheme that we've seen the last couple weeks, right? Where your perimeter runs can't just be jet sweeps of Braden Lindsey. That's a part of it. I'm all for that part of it. But you need some counters off of the jet sweep. You need to just not have it just be that, have something else where you jet sweep here and then boot away or do something different, right? There's things you need to do. But I think that if you can have a little bit more diversity, then I do think you can wear Syracuse down and create some big play opportunities and put them behind, because I don't think Syracuse is a great come-from-behind team offensively. No. I don't.
No.
And so if you can jump on them early, great. But I think it is coming out and establishing the ground attack, Ryan, is definitely going to be a key part of this victory if Notre Dame's going to get it.
And I would say this too, Brian. You made a good point about the coverage advantage that Syracuse has, right? And that this is just in a vacuum of like, hey, we trust our corners to match up man-to-man against teams or just, one-on-one and just in those types of situations. So that gives you the impact of more guys in the box, more guys near the line of scrimmage. And against Notre Dame, like, let's be honest with ourselves, right? Why in the world would Syracuse come into this football game and say, I need to change what I'm doing from a coverage perspective with my corners? Like, they're going to look at what you're doing wide receiver wise and say, I'm going to take my matchups with Garrett Williams against Lorenzo Styles or against against Braden Lindsay or whatever it is. Like, they are going to come into this game, in my opinion, and say, we're not going to change what we do. You're going to be man-to-man on the outside. Show us you can beat us. If you can beat us, then maybe we'll change our step a little bit. But until you can't, we're going to keep doing what we do really well. And that's going to make things, I think, a little challenging. And I mean, I think that this is a game where, as we kind of talk more depthly about what Notre Dame needs to do tomorrow, right? Like, I think that this might be the game where we've talked about it a lot. This might be a game where you have to throw Michael Mayer into the boundary a little bit, right? To get him outside, to get more eyes to him, so that you have to get that extra guy out of the box, or at least make them rethink their strategy of going one-on-one. You might have to hit a double move type of situation, right? Where you hit an explosive play. Like, there's something's going to have to give outside, or
I don't know, Ryan. I don't know, man. You're talking about some crazy stuff that nobody else in the country ever runs. I don't know, man.
It's so, Brian, if Notre Dame is not able to threaten them outside at all, and you have Garrett Williams and Deuce Chestnut just chilling and being the cool customers that they usually are in coverage, then you're hurting yourself, not only in the passing game, but in the run game.
Yeah.
Yes. It's going to be a long day if you can't make those guys uncomfortable.
Yeah. Let's move on to the pass game matchup, Ryan. This is the biggest mismatch of the game. Statistically, this is the biggest mismatch of the game. I want to be clear on that. Statistically, this is a big mismatch. Notre Dame's pass game has been wildly erratic at best and downright bad at other times. Despite the fact they have one of the best tight ends in college football, if not the best, a very talented group of 3 running backs that all can impact the pass game, even though they haven't been utilized really other than the occasional slip screen the last couple games in that regard. And you do have speed at receiver, that you do. I don't care what anybody says. You do. It's not even debatable, in my opinion. And not only is it guys that have shown it on the track in high school, but we've seen them do it on the college football field. You're just not using it correctly. Now, the one good thing that Notre Dame has done in recent weeks, Ryan, is they have done a very good job of protecting the quarterback. And so obviously that's a good thing. That's a positive when you consider how much the quarterback got kind of rattled early in the season and got hit and got smacked a lot early in the season. They've done a very good job, in my opinion, of protecting the quarterback in recent games. If you look at North Carolina, they only gave up 1 sack. They gave up 3 to Stanford, but one of those was late in the game, a little bit of a different situation. And then last week against UNLV, did UNLV get a sack last week? 1? Did they get 1 sack? No, they didn't get any sacks either. So you've given up 3 sacks in the last 4 games. It's a pretty good job of protecting the quarterback. Yep. So that's a positive. Syracuse is a pretty good pass rushing team, but Syracuse does a lot of things that, they're gonna do a lot to come at you, right? They're gonna come at you with pressures. They're gonna bring their linebackers, they're gonna bring DBs at times. I guarantee they're gonna bring a corner fire. I don't know how any team lines up against Notre Dame after watching them on film the last 3 years and doesn't bring at least 1 or 2 corner fires. I don't understand it. And we've seen it work recently. So I would imagine Syracuse, who is a good football team, will see that and beat it and try to beat it, especially since Notre Dame doesn't have RPOs to do anything about it, right? So who was it? Stanford did that, and the Notre Dame receiver just looked like he had no clue what to do. Like they weren't prepared for that. He just looked. You remember that play? And the safety didn't move. He just was like, what am I supposed to do? Like he was pointing. Then ball snapped. He's like, what do I do? And he was completely unprepared for that. And then the quarterback had no concept that it was coming. So they're going to have to improve there. But statistically, this is a mismatch, Ryan. And practically it is too. I mean, you've got 2 very experienced, talented cornerbacks for Syracuse, Deuce Chestnut, and then, of course, Garrett Williams, who is arguably the best corner on the schedule. Is that too bold of a statement to make? I don't think it is. He was on both of our first-team all-opponent team. So I think – and then the other thing – go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, no, I was just saying I couldn't think of anybody that's you could even argue is better, if I'm being honest. Like, I mean, maybe more – like Tony Grimes you could throw in the conversation of as talented, right?
Well,
as a football player
he's
right
more
now,
athletic, but he's not anywhere close. No, I think the only kid that you could even really consider is maybe the Kelly kid from Stanford. That's really the only one that I'd even have a conversation with you about, to be honest with you, at this point in time. But I don't even know if I'd go. I mean, nobody at USC is, nobody at Boston College is in that conversation. Nobody at Clemson's in that conversation. Nobody at Navy's in that conversation. So I think I would say he is. I think you can at least make a case. There may be some people that like, one of the kids from Ohio State. I don't know why you'd want to make that case, but you never know. Yeah. Obviously, you mentioned Tony Grimes just being athletic, but as far as just all the other aspects going to, I think the Kelly kid from Stanford is probably the only one that you could have this conversation about. But even with I guess we talked about the pass rush, Ryan. I think the fact that they've been so good at protecting the quarterback only adds to the frustration of why the pass game hasn't been as good. Now, here's the interesting thing. The touchdown to interception ratio the last 4 games has been pretty good. They've thrown 9 touchdowns and two interceptions in the last 4 games. So, like, that part of it looks good. Obviously, what we saw against North Carolina and BYU was good, but then it just goes away. And that's the thing. It's like it just disappears. You become a completely different team. The running back aspects that you utilize so effectively against North Carolina and Cal kind of slowly disappears. Your quarterback becomes less and less confident. I don't know how Drew Pine gets less confident the more he plays, but that's what we're seeing. Now, you hope that he bounces back. I had somebody ask in the chat, do I think his erratic play had something to do with getting hit? His erratic play began before he got hit. That was late in the first half. So I don't think that's the case. He didn't really throw that much in the second half. I mean, he didn't really throw a whole lot after that particular play. So those are the things you have to look at, Ryan, and say, does Notre Dame have some matchup advantages they can exploit? I do think they can. I think there's some things they can do at the safety level. That's what I was going to say earlier, Ryan. I think one thing that has made their pass defense even better, even though there's some areas I think Notre Dame can exploit, where Syracuse has gotten a lot better in the secondary this year compared to last year, is their safety coverage is a lot better. A lot better, which allows them to do more things man coverage-wise when they want to, that can take some of those things away. That combined with the range of their defense, also, their safeties and their linebackers are both very rangy, which also makes their zone coverages effective because they can cover a lot of ground. So they're a hard team to pass on if you don't have dudes or if you're not real smart and the timing isn't there. But I think there's some things that they can do, Ryan, in this matchup. But on paper, it's advantage Syracuse in a big way.
Yeah, no, it's not even close on paper. I mean, Syracuse has not only the 2 good corners that you talked about, but the 2 safeties that you just mentioned, Elijah Clark and Carter, whose first name is escaping for some reason. They're both Jihad Carter, excuse me. All good football players. And the one thing I like most about Michael Jones, Brian, is that he's a really good zone dropper, man. Like, they do some like Tampa 2 stuff with him at times where he drops to the middle of the field. I'm like, he looks very, very comfortable in that type of role. So they have a lot of good coverage players. But the thing that I mentioned yesterday that I want to harp on is I don't think this is a game that you have to create some explosive plays outside, whether that is putting Michael Mayer out there to try to give them a different look, or just Lorenzo Styles and Braden Lindsey making a play, or Tobias Merriweather, whoever it is. You have to create a couple plays. But my big question mark, and I talked about it yesterday, was how are you going to defend Michael Mayer? How are you going to do that? And how are you going to defend these running backs if you start to get them more involved in the passing game, like we saw be successful early on in the season? Because while I mean, 100%, Clark and Jihad Carter are very good football players, they're more zone coverage players, right? Like, they're not really man-to-man coverage guys. So are you going to bring them down to defend a Michael Mayer in the slot, if that's kind of your thought process? Are you going to let Michael Jones have a little bit of that conversation? Is the rover Justin Barron going to be a guy that you're going to trust in that situation? Are you going to throw multiple things at him? I want to know what the Michael Mayer plan this week is, because we've seen teams. Some have had good Michael Mayer plans for the most part. Some have had really bad Michael Mayer plans. I feel like there hasn't really been a team that's been like in between. Either it's been good plan, bad plan. So I'm curious to see what their Michael Mayer plan is. But even more than that, I am really curious to see how Notre Dame attacks Syracuse in the with their running backs in the passing game. I think that could be a sneaky X factor in this football game. I want to see it because, again, I think that there are a lot of good players in that secondary and on the second level, but I don't think outside of the two corners, I don't think they have a lot of great man-to-man cover guys, right? Like I don't know if them having Marlowe Wax one-on-one against Michael Mayer is going to be a good recipe for success. So what's the plan against Mayer? What's the plan against the running backs? That's what I'm looking forward to, Brian. Outside of creating a couple plays outside. However you do that, we'll see, but they need to create a couple explosive plays in that department.
I need to respond to something in the chat. It's from Wayne Miller. You guys are asking a lot of ifs. Do you really think anything will change? What are we supposed to do, Wayne? Do you want us to get on here every day and say, hey, guys, nothing's going to change. This is going to suck, so just get ready, brace yourself for Saturday. Our job is not to change things. Our job is not to call plays. Our job is not to do that. Our job is to analyze the team and tell you this is who Syracuse is. This is who Notre Dame is. This is what Notre Dame needs to do to have success. Okay, so yes, there's going to be ifs because the game hasn't been played yet. There's always ifs going into a game. If this guy, if that's for everybody in college football. Until the game is played, it's nothing but ifs. Number one. And number two, I don't know what Notre Dame is going to do. I don't coach at Notre Dame, but we're going to tell you what they need to do, and that's what this show is about, right? And every time you're doing a preview, it's ifs. There's a lot. If we were covering Syracuse, there'd be a lot of ifs. If your defensive line can hold up, if your safeties can figure out a way to stop Michael Mayer, if you can protect against certain things that Notre Dame can do, if you can put pressure on the quarterback, there's a lot of ifs. That's what a preview is. And so, no, I don't have a clue if they're going to change anything. I have no idea. I'm not optimistic, but that doesn't mean we're going to not do our job because they're not doing theirs. So, I just take that however it's going to go, Ryan. There's four things that are going to determine the success in the pass game for me. Number one, because Syracuse does a lot of cover four on the field, I do think there's some opportunities for some RPO success if you're creative with it. Now, the counter argument to that is this. They are very good, and you mentioned it the other day, they're very good at coming up against that stuff. Purdue tried to throw a lot of perimeter screens, and they came up and blew a lot of them up because they come up aggressively. But to me, if you show a willingness to throw the perimeter stuff, the RPO, the perimeter screens, even if you call some perimeter screens, but if you're willing to run that stuff and get them to aggressively attack it, I do think you'll have some opportunities to hit some stuff down the field on them because they're very aggressive coming downhill. And I think they're going to be especially aggressive against Notre Dame because of the way Notre Dame plays. This is where knowing who you are is going to be important when it comes to attacking what the other team is going to do. I know this is who we are. This is our tendency. This is who we are. This is how every team has defended us. Safety's less than 10 yards away from the ball in a lot of different instances. All those type of things are kind of part of who you are, right? So use that to your advantage. Set that up. So I think number one is the RPO game and then having some stuff that you can immediately go to off of it, number one. Number two, using Michael Mayer to your advantage. There are some things they can do, and this is going to kind of go with 12 personnel as well. You have to be willing to throw the ball out of 12 personnel more effectively and with more variety. I definitely think there's some stuff they can do against 12 personnel, Ryan. The way that Syracuse plays 12 personnel, you can do things where you can isolate that backside safety, much like they did against Stanford, and have some one-on-ones to the field that create some opportunities, especially in the slot and especially to the running backs. So I definitely think there's some stuff there that you can do out of 12 personnel. And that includes you're going to have to use Mitchell Evans in the pass game. You're going to have to use Mitchell Evans in the pass game. And I'm talking about down the field. I think that's where they can steal some yards, in my opinion, is getting Mitchell Evans off some sort of play action, with Michael Mayer being used as a decoy, maybe running a crossing route from them being on the opposite sides. Maybe you do something where, you have Michael Mayer be on the line and Mitchell Evans off, and Mayer runs just a wide fade right now, and they're going to get three guys running with him. And then maybe bring Mitchell Evans on kind of a wide fade, or maybe bring Mitchell Evans from the backside on a drag route. When there's a lot of things you can do that I think you're going to have to try to steal some yards with him. And I think that's going to be one of those things that could be a big part of this game. And then the last part of it is you're going to have to be willing to throw the ball outside. Yeah, you can't avoid that part of the field. They have avoided that part of the field against far inferior teams. If you are not willing to throw the ball outside more and design more outside shots, which if you're going to take a a 6-foot guy against a 6-foot guy. That's not a matchup I love, right? But this is a game. I'm gonna say it again, and no, I don't have a lot of faith that they're going to do this, but I'm going to remain optimistic. But this is a game where a Deion Colsey and a Tobias Merriweather can be very impactful. Or to your point, Ryan, throw Michael Mayer out there and see how they line up. If they put a corner on them, throw it up. Yep. Those are the things that you can do. And so if you can do those things and attack those things, then that forces them to defend a little bit more. And that's where those third and fourth quarter creases can open up for some big runs. Those are the things they can do in the pass game, Ryan, that can have some success against what Syracuse is. And again, when we talk success against this Syracuse defense, it means completing passes for 7 yards, completing passes for 8-9 yards. It means being efficient and then hoping to create some big play opportunities. It's not dropping back, throwing the ball 50 times for 500 yards. That's not what we're talking about. If they throw for 400 yards, part of me thinks that that's probably a bad thing. It means because they can't run the football. So I think for me, if they can do those things to really finally force them to defend the width of the field all the way down, then I think this could be have some success. Because Ryan, I'm going to ask you, how many throws can you remember off the top of your head Notre Dame completing outside the numbers this season? It's not many.
No, it's not.
Not many.
It's not.
They've hit a couple like wide fades, a couple, Michael Mayer on a wheel route last week, a couple running back stuff. They don't complete a lot of balls outside. So again, it's another example of it's a lot easier to defend Notre Dame inside the numbers, which means you can scrunch everything down, which explains why they're hard to rip off the big runs because there's always somebody there to kind of close on you. So those are things I think they can do. Whether or not they will do it, is this easy? No, it's not easy. It's not easy at all. This is a good, and here's the crazy thing too, Ryan. When you look at the yards per game, like it's pretty indicative of who they are, because they have the game where they held Wagner to 19 yards. That pads the numbers a little bit. But then also the Purdue game where Purdue passed for 424 yards, those two things balance each other out a little bit. A lot of those Purdue yards were like late in the game. And then when you look at Syracuse too, I mean, they've 197 to Louisville, 105 to UConn, 138 to Virginia, 160 to NC State, 157 to Clemson. They've given up 5 touchdown passes all year. 3 of them were Purdue, and they've picked off 7 passes. So they've been consistently pretty good. The only team that went for over 8, actually Purdue went for 7.6 yards per attempt. The only other team higher than that was Louisville in the opener, who went for 8.6. But Louisville threw 0 touchdowns and 2 picks. So, it's one of those things where, 3.6 against Virginia, 5.5 against UConn, 5.2 against NC State, 6.3 against them. That you have to be willing to be patient and get the ball outside. 4-yard gain, 6-yard gain, 5-yard gain, 3-yard gain, 2-yard gain on some perimeter passes. Because Coach Freeman said something yesterday, Ryan, and it's true. It's true also here. And he said jet sweeps he views as an extension of the run game. I agree wholeheartedly. But you know what also to me is an extension of the run game, and what I count as a run play, a 5-yard out cut off RPO. Exactly. Yeah. Because sometimes, hey, you're not going to lose your mind if you only gain 2 yards on a run play, right? You shouldn't lose your mind if you throw a bubble screen and only gets 2 yards, because again, you're moving the change, you're forcing to defend the width, and eventually something's going to open up. But then if they're coming down that hard to blow up a bubble screen for a 2-yard gain, there's something you can do off of that to take advantage of that if you're creative enough. So I agree with Coach Freeman completely that jet sweeps are absolutely, it's considered a pass because, it's a shovel pass, right? It's technically a throw. It's a run play. So's an RPO. So's an RPO hitch, an RPO out. I count quick game, period. I've always counted this as a coach. I've always counted quick game as an extension of the run game. I don't evaluate my success numbers in the quick game the way that I do drop back and play action and things like that. It's much more in line with what I'm getting from the run game than what I'm getting in the pass game. So I think that's going to have to be a big part of what they do, Ryan.
Yeah, and I think that the number that really pops to me as far as looking at Syracuse's, Brian, is just kind of reaffirm, I think, Notre Dame's ability to create some explosive plays is they are getting up, not even the yards per attempt number for a second. They're only letting up 9.5 yards per completion. That is bananas.
Yeah.
That is a just silly number. Clearly, Syracuse is living off of not giving up big plays. And I think that in this football game, outside especially, but just in general in the passing game, Notre Dame has not been a team that has created explosive plays in the passing game nearly enough. And I think that is going to be a huge breaking point in this game. It's a place that you've struggled, and it's a place that Syracuse has been they're second in the country. So they've been almost as good as anyone in the country, quite literally. So that's a breaking point that I think we need to see in this game, because that secondary is good. They trust them wholeheartedly, but you need to make them uncomfortable. If you do make them uncomfortable, then the defensive coordinator and the defensive staff is going to have to start second-guessing themselves, right? Starting to think about doing something different. That 9.5 yards per completion is just a ridiculous number. Notre Dame has to find ways to create explosive plays in the passing game during this game.
Absolutely. And they have to protect the quarterback. That's going to be a big key as
well. Yep.
Let's go here to this matchup. Scoring offense, scoring defense. This is something we do we don't spend a lot of time on this, Ryan. Obviously, Notre Dame has not moved the ball effectively all year. They have not scored the ball effectively all year. They're not very good on the red zone. They've only had they've had 2 really good third down games that kind of counter by a lot of not very good games. They turn the ball over too much. And the exception of third down, where Syracuse is about where Notre Dame is, they are way ahead of Notre Dame in every capacity. Now, you say, okay, some of this is inflated by the fact that they played Wagner, right? But we brought that up the other day. But the point that we also made is it doesn't really change the narrative at all if you only look at what they've done against FBS teams. So, for example, their scoring defense is 6th overall. If you only look at teams against FBS opponents, they drop down to 10th, right? So, I mean, they're still good. They're not going from like 6th to 30th if you take that away, right? If you look at their total defense, I'm sorry, hold on a second. Let me just make sure that I got that correct. Okay, so if you look at their scoring defense, they're 10th. Yes. If you look at their total defense, right now they're 13th. If you take out the Wagner game, they're still 20th against FBS opponents. So it doesn't really change much if you take that out, but it does change it a little bit. The one that drops down even a little bit more is the yards per play. That goes from 4.7 to 5.1. And that's a large part to what Purdue did against them. So, and then what Clemson did last week in the run game. So it doesn't change a whole lot. They're still really good on defense. And Notre Dame's going to have to play well in order to have some success. But this is a game where, 27 to 30 points get you a W in a lot of instances. So we're not asking that Notre Dame needs to come out and score 45 like they did on North Carolina. Get to 27 to 30, and you'll have a really good chance to win this football game. So clearly advantage Syracuse in this instance, Ryan, from a statistical matchup. But I'm going to just continue to contend till the day that I die that this football team has the talent to be effective against Syracuse. It's whether or not you're going to game plan, scheme, and execute well enough to take advantage of those opportunities.
I mean, I could point out several one-on-one matchups, Notre Dame's offense for Syracuse defense, where I would give the advantage to Notre Dame. As a whole, it's been about consistency, man. Like, the Notre Dame offense has just not been consistent for as good as they looked against North Carolina. It's as bad as they've looked against Stanford, right? Like, they just have been a very, very inconsistent team. While Syracuse, even in last week's loss to Clemson, although they gave up a bunch of yards rushing, I mean, they still held that team and made them force a lot of mistakes against Clemson for the majority of that football game. So this is Notre Dame's biggest test to date from a offense versus defensive perspective as far as the rankings are concerned, right? What we see on paper. It's going to be interesting to look at because, again, Brian, like, we have seen moments where you're like, okay, Notre Dame can turn the corner here. And then you've seen far too many where it's like, okay, well, they just took a couple steps back now. Which Notre Dame offense are you going to get? I don't know. I have no idea. But all I know is they need to show up during this game to win this football game because Syracuse has a good defense, and they're going to try to control the game tempo-wise on their offensive side of the football as well. So it's going to be one of those games where You have to come and you have to play against a really good unit. That's going to be the separator in this one, is how good Notre Dame offense is against this defense.
So, Ryan, when you look at the matchup of the Notre Dame offense against the Syracuse defense, it's a match of a unit that's been very good against a unit that has not been good for most of the season. The matchup between the Notre Dame defense and the Syracuse offense is two very comparable units, two units that are really good but not great. And I'd say that at times Notre Dame's defense at times has been really good. Syracuse has just been steady on offense all year. There's again, Wagner's going to, kind of take things out a little bit because he scored 59, but they're not a great offense by any stretch, but they're a very consistent offense. Notre Dame's defense has had more dominant moments than Syracuse's offense, but then has had more downs than the Syracuse offense, which makes this a very, very intriguing matchup. The other thing to consider is, and we'll pull up the numbers now. The one thing to consider now is Notre Dame has faced significantly better offenses than what Syracuse has faced defenses.
Right.
And I think that's very, very true. I mean, Notre Dame has faced two offenses that are in the top 10 in scoring, I believe, still, correct? I believe North Carolina is still in the top 10 in scoring. They are 8th. Notre Dame has faced the number 2 scoring team in the country, held them to 28 points below their season average. North Carolina is 8th in the nation in scoring offense. They held them to 9 points below their scoring average. And again, we talked about this. They had a garbage touchdown with less than a minute to go in that game, which helped them in that regard as well. So, Notre Dame has faced obviously much better offenses, in my opinion, than what Syracuse has faced on defenses until the Clemson game. Obviously, Clemson was the exception. So once they played that game, then obviously that changed things a little bit. But Notre Dame has held to this day still every single opponent below their season scoring average. And the thing about it is, Ryan, this matchup right here is the key to this game and to this particular part of the matchup, right? Offense versus defense. It's the Notre Dame rush defense against the Syracuse rush offense. Both units have been, I say, a little not as good as I expect them to be. If you look at Syracuse, I like to use context, right, Ryan? And I think context really matters. And to me, context is, what are you doing against the better teams? So you look at Syracuse's numbers, and they are averaging 179.3 yards per game and 4.8 yards per carry. It ranks in the top 50 in both categories. This is the one thing that's different, though, when you take out the Wagner game. So Syracuse had a huge game rushing the football against Wagner. They ran for 388 yards. They ran for 208 against Louisville, 156 against UConn, 125 against Purdue, 75 against Virginia, 179 against NC State, and then 124 against Clemson. Now, if you take out the Wagner game and you look at just how all the teams in college football rank when you take only FBS games into account, they drop way down. They drop all the way down to 69th in rushing yards per game, and they drop down to 69th in actually, that didn't click over. So then they also fall down to 75th in yards per attempt. So they drop down significantly when you take out the Wagner game. And I think that puts this into a little bit more of an even matchup, Ryan, when you take out because Notre Dame hasn't played an FCS opponent. So when you take that out of the equation, all of a sudden you're talking about the 69th rush offense and the 75th in yards per play. Notre Dame now all of a sudden ranks higher than Syracuse in this regard. So that's going to make this a very intriguing matchup. Tackles for loss is the same right now, obviously. And then when you look at, because it's Notre Dame's tackles for loss and then Syracuse's tackles for loss allowed. And when you take that into account against just FBS opponents, Syracuse drops down to 81st. So if you only look at games against FBS opponents, Ryan, it's hard to argue that Notre Dame should at worst be even in this matchup. And you could make a much better case that they should have the advantage statistically. But whether or not that plays out in the game, Ryan, is going to have a huge, huge impact on Notre Dame's ability to win this football game, because this is a Syracuse team that against Power 5 opponents has scored 31, 32, 22, 24, and 21 points, which puts them very much in line with where Notre Dame is scoring points. right? Because we talk a lot about Notre Dame's offense, and somebody made a comment the other day about, y'all act like Syracuse, Notre Dame's no juggernaut. Notre Dame's not a juggernaut. We never said that they are, but we're trying to give you some context to where Notre Dame is. Notre Dame ranks 72nd in the country. Actually, let's look at in scoring offense, but if you look at against Power 5 teams, Notre Dame ranks 59th against Power 5 teams, and Syracuse ranks 49th. So much closer to where Notre Dame is offensively than a team that has the numbers that they have, Ryan. So I think this makes this statistically a very intriguing matchup. I'll allow you to kind of talk about when Syracuse is on, what makes it go, and then where Notre Dame can have some personnel advantages.
It's really weird kind of comparing this Syracuse rushing attack to what it was last year, Brian, because if you would have told me before the season that Syracuse would be so much better throwing the ball than they were last season, I would have assumed that they were a more efficient rushing attack than they were last year as well. And that kind of hasn't been the case. And it's been a little odd because last year I felt like every game Sean Tucker was ripping off a 70-yard touchdown. Like it really felt like that last year. And in most cases he was. if we're kind of just look back at it, he was creating a lot of explosive plays last year. I feel like they haven't created as many explosive runs this year as they did last year, just kind of on a game-to-game basis for Syracuse. But what they have is they have a backfield duo that when they're on and when things are rolling are a very difficult duo to defend. Because you talk about Sean Tucker, who is 5'11", 210 pounds, brings a pretty physical style, but the thing that really separates him is he's got great acceleration. So when he's able to get downhill, which that's his bread and butter, whether it's inside zone or outside zone, he's a one-cut runner, get downhill and explode to daylight. Or it's Garrett Schrader, who is a 6'4", 230-pound quarterback who's a good athlete overall, good speed and physical, has some power to his profile. When they're able to get that read option game running and able to get him involved in the running game, they are a difficult duo to start. But I think that the difference this year is that I don't think offensive line-wise they're playing quite as well as they did last season. They have a stud at left tackle, Matthew Bergeron, who I think is a really good football player. The rest of the offensive line, I think, is a little heavy-footed, and they don't really – last year they really structured as more of an outside zone-heavy team. This year they become more inside dictated of inside zone, some power stuff, which is
I want to talk about that,
different.
Ryan. I want to talk about that because it's a very similar problem to what Notre Dame's going through, except that Syracuse has a quarterback that's is more able to take some of the pressure off than Notre Dame has had since the second game of the year. But it is interesting because they do have a new offensive coordinator. Robert Anae is their new offensive coordinator. And you are correct. They are definitely a team this year, Ryan, that has changed the look of their offense. Now, they're not playing to the strength of their backs, in my opinion. They're running a lot more gap scheme this year than they ran last year. It's pretty balanced between gap scheme and zone stuff. Whereas last year, I thought that they were more of a zone-oriented team, in my opinion. I felt last year. For example, here's some numbers. If you just look at Pro Football Focus last season, they had them down as having 254 zone calls and then 123 gap plays, right? If you go to 2022, so that's almost 2-1. If you go to 2022, it's 100 zone plays and 88 gap plays. And so to your point, you're seeing a lot more of those designed just downhill kind of in between the tackle stuff. You're not seeing as much of that outside zone. And if you go, I was looking at this a little earlier. If you go look at Sean Tucker's highlight tape, his first 5 touchdowns on that tape, and I stopped watching halfway through, are all outside zone plays where they stretch, and then boom, he hits that thing vertical run. He has to make one guy miss. And when you're in space, it's a lot easier to make, run through arm tackles than when you're in a crowd. Right. And they've changed that. And they've gone away from that. And I think part of it is the new coordinator, but part of it is, I think, to your point of the offensive line, is they're not as athletic as they were. And not that they were a super athletic line last year, but they are slow-footed. They're not even saying about athletic. They're not real quick. They're pretty slow-footed. So slow-footed on the perimeter. And I think that's also been a reason. But it's similar to Notre Dame is if you want to here's what's going to be interesting about this. What's one of the run plays that has hurt Notre Dame the most this year? It's outside zone. It's when Notre Dame has had mistakes, a lot of times it's been an outside. Marshall did it. Cal did it. UNLV did it. It's that outside zone where Notre Dame's linebackers have bad fits and it opens up a crease. You're able to kind of seal them inside and just open up a crease. So does Syracuse see that and then maybe go back to something that they were good at in the past, or do they continue to do what they've been doing? That's a really good question and a very intriguing aspect to this matchup, Brian.
Yeah, no, it's something that I'm looking forward to seeing because, to your point, Brian, like I think that really does sit in Sean Tucker's wheelhouse, right? Like he is that one cut and go type of runner. He's not a pure downhill player. Like he's not a guy that I want to necessarily, just have a single gap that he is designated to and just go, buddy. Like I want him to be able to have options in the running game. And that's what zone kind of presents to you. It's not always designed to hit in one spot. It could hit backside. It could hit front side. It could bounce. There's a lot of different things that could happen with zone. And I think that that's the runner that Sean Tucker is. And I think that kind of plays into your strengths. And it'll be an interesting matchup, just offensive line versus defensive line, because we both agree that the offensive line for Syracuse is not the quickest in the world, right? Like they aren't the most athletic overall. That's one thing Notre Dame has up front, especially, is they have some quick defensive linemen that can take advantage of that slow-footedness. So interested to see that matchup, especially because, again, on paper, without the context of getting Wagner off the schedule, it looks like it's lopsided for Syracuse. But I would also contend that this is a 1-to-1 matchup, or maybe I would even give Notre Dame the advantage in this department. Like I don't think it's unrealistic to say that Notre Dame has the ability and has the film at times to say we should be able to have a good contest to stop the run. But at some point, it's got to be show me, and we have to see it on Saturday.
The concern is the size. That's the concern I have, is how do you neutralize that? Do you try to play big boy football with them, which is what I thought they tried to do against Ohio State? And in the second half, Ohio State said, okay, if you want to try to play big boy football with us, we're way bigger than you, and we're going to wear you out.
Right.
I thought they tried to do that against Marshall as well. They were trying to, gap contain and two gap at times inside, and it didn't work. I feel like they've gone away from that more recently. They're allowing the defensive linemen to penetrate more. I feel like observing film, Ryan, I feel like they have changed. I think that's a good coaching adjustment that we've seen, as Al Golden has not asked them to do as much of that as we've seen in the past. And so I think that's allowed them to be aggressive. Do we see more of that? Do they allow this group to penetrate and attack? Because here's the danger. When you're playing an outside zone team, if you penetrate, yeah, that's great. You can blow the run up, but it also, against a stretch play, it also could lead to you getting washed out and they cut behind you. And that's the danger. Yep. So that's where the linebackers have to really fill and be effective. That's why Syracuse has had some success, because their linebackers do a good job of cleaning that stuff out. Notre Dame's linebackers have not. So that's going to be a very intriguing part of this matchup, Ryan, if they do, in fact, go back to some of the outside stuff. I'm very curious to see that being the case. I'm very curious to see how that dynamic plays out in this game, because it's their size against your quickness. Which one wins? Mm-hmm. That's going to be a big part of this. That's going to be a big part of this as well. Yep. Let's go to the pass game matchup, Ryan. This is a very interesting one. Very, very even across the board in a lot of areas. The only difference, obviously, is efficiency and interceptions, which go hand in hand. Those two things tie in, because Notre Dame doesn't pick anybody off, so it's hard to have a lower quarterback rating when you don't force any turnovers. Yards per game is very similar. Yards per attempt, Syracuse has the advantage. Yards per completion, Notre Dame has the advantage. Touchdowns almost equal. Notre Dame is much better at getting pressure on the quarterback. Syracuse has struggled to protect the quarterback, which at times has to do with the fact that Garrett Trader will scramble around and take a couple sacks that way. But they aren't a great pass protecting team outside of Matthew Bergeron. And that is an area where you look at this and say, okay, they are scheme oriented. They have good receivers, but I don't think they have lights out receivers. Notre Dame has played better receiving cores than what they're going to face on Saturday. Several. Okay. Now, Rondé Gadsden II is a really good football player, but they have faced better players than him as well. Mm-hmm. Now, they have size. That's a little bit more than what they've seen. Stanford had some of that, but Stanford didn't really hurt Notre Dame with their size. Okay, and so there's a lot of different aspects of this matchup that's interesting. But to me, it's going to come down to two things, Ryan. Pressure the quarterback. Three things. Pressure the quarterback. Maintain gap control in the pass game. Don't let him scramble. And then three, limit big plays. If you can limit Syracuse's big plays, they have a hard time moving the football. That's true in the pass game, and that's true in the run game. Syracuse is not a really good grinded out 8-9 drive team consistently. They'll get some, but they don't consistently do it, which again is why, as we pointed out before, when you look at this football team, they have scored 31, 32, 22, 24, and 21 points against Power 5 teams. It's very similar to what Notre Dame has done, right? So that's going to be a key, limiting big plays. And the area of that where that concerns me the most, Ryan, is the pass game. They are going to take some shots outside against the Notre Dame corners. I guarantee it. They're going to take some shots. The question is, do you give them enough time to throw it accurately? That's a question, because you want to have Garrett Schrader sit in the pocket and try to beat you from the pocket. That's good for you if you play your game. If you don't, he's going to sit in the pocket, hit Rondé Gadsden down the middle of the field. Now, not just outside shots, Ryan, but I also see them taking some shots downfield against the Notre Dame safety. I'm shocked more teams haven't done that. Big part of the reason why those routes take a little bit of time. You can't just hit like outside go routes. You can just hit 3-step, bam, let it go, right? Seam shots, you can't do that because you've got to clear the safeties first. You know what I mean? Right. And teams just haven't had a lot of time to do that. If they can protect the quarterback, they're going to take some shots over the heads of the safeties. The pass rush needs to make sure they don't allow that to happen. So that's going to be the big battle in this game that's going to make this particular matchup very, very interesting. In an otherwise pretty even matchup, Ryan.
And this week, I would challenge Isaiah Foskey. I would challenge him because we've seen, Brian, right? Like there's been moments where we see the old Isaiah Foskey, and last week he had 3 sacks, right? But I would remind Isaiah, hey, against Ohio State, you did not have a very good football game facing off against probably 2 NFL-level offensive tackles at the next level, right? This game, you have another opportunity to play against an NFL-level offensive tackle, Matthew Bergeron, and I would throw him out there, man. I wouldn't just throw Isaiah against the right tackle and just let him eat alive a less talented offensive tackle. I would put him against Matthew Bergeron and say, this is a prove me game, buddy. This is prove me right here. You got to make plays one-on-one because I know that Syracuse has a lot of confidence in Bergeron. They're going to put him on the island, and they're going to say, okay, our guy is going to be better than your guy, and Notre Dame has to be able to say, Isaiah, this is the week, man. This is the week that you have to have your best game of the season, and that goes
money
across. It is a
money game for him and Jason Adamiola. Money game for them.
Interior pass rush should be huge in this game as too, Brian, because like we said, I mean, the left guard may be 6'6", 370 pounds or whatever he is, but that comes with you're sacrificing something to be that size, right? Like we'll just keep it like that. And there should be opportunities, whether it is Jason Adamiola, whether it is Howard Cross, whether it is Riley Mills moving inside on some obvious passing situations, there should be opportunities to get home as a pass rush. And you're correct. Garrett Schrader is a difficult task because of his ability to extend things, to be that extension as a runner, as outside of the pocket as a passer. Those things make him a tough cover. And this year, he's been a lot more efficient as a passer. I mean, last year he looked like an option quarterback. This year he looks like a quarterback. So credit for him for taking that step, and credit for Robert Anai to doing things that he does well in the passing game. In order for them to really calm what the success they've had, I mentioned it yesterday as well. There's 2 players that I think that you have to have a huge emphasis on in this game. One's Rondé Gadsden, the second that you mentioned already. You have to have a plan for him, whether that is Rover, whether that is a safety, whether it is a linebacker dropping underneath, short zone, whatever it is. And you have to have an answer for Sean Tucker in the passing game. I think he comes into this game with like 28 receptions on the season, and he's a player that not just out of the backfield as a check down player. They'll line him up in the slot at times. They'll throw him some stuff out of the backfield, like real route tree stuff. And there's going to be opportunities, I think, for Notre Dame to have to figure out how to match up against him, whether, again, that is a linebacker or a safety coming down, whatever it is. So those are the 2 guys, but I agree with you. Pass rush is paramount in this football game, and you have to have a plan for the players that can create big plays in the passing game for them. And I think that those are 2 of the biggest mismatches they have is Rondé Gadsden and Sean Tucker. But at the end of the day, this game is on the defensive line. I have confidence that Notre Dame is going to come to play as a coverage unit, because for the most part, we've seen good coverage throughout the entirety of the season. We have seen a mixed bag as far as from game to game. There's some games where the defensive line looks fantastic, and there's other games where they just look average. This has to be a game where you come to play and you create a ton of havoc in the backfield.
I'm gonna throw a different matchup at you, Ryan. Yes, the Matthew
Okay.
Bergeron, that's great money game and all that. However, I want to see him dominate Dakota Davis because see the thing about Isaiah, he's not a right or a left guy. It's field boundary, so he's going to be matched up against both guys. Dakota Davis has been to me their individually biggest weak spot in pass protection. He's given up 15 pressures on the year. And he's a guy that I think in that matchup, he's a big, slow-footed guy. That's a matchup Isaiah Foskey can and should dominate. That's also a matchup I'd really like to see Riley Mills and Justin Adamula have success there as well, because they're both going to find themselves matched up against him at different times. I really, really want to see that. And then the other one is the center matchup. Carlos Vettorello is a guy that's, in my opinion, he hasn't been great protecting the quarterback. He'll give up penetration. He'll give up a push. This is one where you want to see them have success. And to back up kind of your point, Ryan, if you just look at the Pro Football Focus numbers, Notre Dame's interior linemen have given up 15 pressures this season. So, 16 if you count Andrew Kostofik. Zeke Curl's given up 6, but Zeke hasn't given up a single pressure in the last 3 games. His 6 pressures were in the first 4 games. 2 against Ohio State, 1 against Marshall, 1 against Cal, 2 against North Carolina. He's really settled down. The Syracuse interior linemen have given up, 25, 26. They've given up 26 pressures this season against very similar drop-back numbers. So that's an area where Notre Dame has to be good because, as you said, you nailed it on the D-line. When they're on, they're dominant. When they're not, they look mediocre. But the challenge this week is a little different, Ryan, because it's not just about pressuring him. It's also about containing him and not allowing him to scramble. He's got over 200 scramble yards in the year this year. That's what they did a great job of with Drake May, is they kept him in the pocket after the first series. You have to do the same thing here while also disrupting him, because the thing about Garrett Schrader is he will make mistakes if you keep him in the pocket and get in his face, as most quarterbacks do. And, somebody commented, Notre Dame has played better quarterbacks than Garrett Schrader.
Sure.
I don't think they've played a quarterback that's as dynamic as a runner as Garrett Schrader, except maybe Drake May. Maybe. But here's the difference. Yeah. I think this offensive line is more physical than the North Carolina offensive line. And North Carolina has a very passive scheme that allowed Notre Dame to kind of eat up and contain better. Syracuse is more effective that way. They kind of lean on you, open up run lanes in that regard when he scrambles in that regard. So it's going to really require them to be good, and their linebackers are going to have to be really disciplined. That's going to be another key, is they're going to have to be very disciplined to slow him down. So, and then the other thing too with the linebackers is last week against UNLV was one of the best jobs I've seen this linebacking core do all season, if not the best, in sniffing out screens and playing the jet sweeps and the perimeter stuff. We're going to see that this week from Syracuse. They will absolutely use Sean Tucker in a run game. Al Golden nailed it yesterday when he talked about it. He's like, they're going to line him up out wide. They're going to run him out of the back. They're going to do all these things with the pass game. You have to be prepared for it. And that's going to put a lot of stress on the Notre Dame linebackers. So they had their best game of the year last week. They need to build on that against Syracuse. To me, the linebackers, more than any other group, are the key to shutting down the Syracuse pass game, because that includes not just handling Sean Tucker. It means getting up underneath the in-breaking routes down the field, but it also means protecting against the scrambles from Garrett Schrader. They have a lot on their plate this week. They're going to have to be ready for the challenge. There's no question about it.
No doubt.
Let's go to the last part of this matchup, Ryan, and this is the Syracuse scoring offense against the Notre Dame scoring defense. Again, on paper, looks good, very similar. Notre Dame is slightly higher just by 1 ranking spot in the points per game. Notre Dame is significantly higher in yards per game. Notre Dame is higher. Syracuse has better yards per play. Notre Dame has the worst red zone defense in college football. Syracuse has been good in the red zone overall, not great at scoring touchdowns, and their third down defenses are very similar. Obviously, Syracuse doesn't turn it over much, and Notre Dame doesn't force turnovers, which is a concerning part of this game plan. But again, when you take out the Wagner game, it looks a lot different. It looks advantage Notre Dame. So if you just go look at what they've done against FBS teams and you look at where Syracuse ranks, they fall down to 51st in scoring offense. That's a 16-point advantage for Notre Dame. Notre Dame already has a 31-point advantage in total defensive numbers. When you look at Syracuse, when you look at just against FBS numbers, Syracuse falls down to 75th. Big advantage for Notre Dame. And then in the yards per play as well, they fall down quite a bit there as well. If you look at Syracuse, they fall down to 56th, from 26th to 56th in yards per play when you take out the Wagner game where they averaged almost 10 yards a play. And then if you look at them from the rest of the games, Ryan, they've had some solid games. Again, they're very consistent. 6-8 against Louisville, 6-1 against UConn, 4-7 against Purdue, 5-0 against Virginia, 7-1 against NC State, 5-4 against Clemson. All solid performances, nothing special. I apologize. They went for 10 yards a rush against Wagner. They were 11.1 per play against Wagner. So that definitely inflated the overall numbers. So this is a matchup that Notre Dame should be able to keep Syracuse in the teens and 20s. It's very similar to Stanford. This team reminds me a lot of their Stanford with a more mobile quarterback and a better running back, right? I mean, as far as how they match up, like the dynamics, they're not the same schematically. They're not the same personnel. They have different types of personnel, but we're talking about the effectiveness of their offense is very similar to what Stanford is. Now, they go about things differently, but this is a game you should be able to keep them in the teens or early low 20s. If you keep them in the teens or low 20s, this is a game you should win. And then it goes back to can the defense or the offense score at all, which they haven't done in their losses. So on paper, Ryan, with the exception of red zone, but here's the thing people have to understand about the red zone. Red zone is a problem. It's kind of embarrassing that Notre Dame literally has not stopped anyone in the red zone, not once all year. Couple things about it, though. They've given up, 3 or 4 fourth down touchdowns this year. Because they'll do a good job of keeping you out, but then, you get it on 3rd or 4th down. Even UNLV needed 2 plays from like the 2-yard line to get in, and they ran a pitch play. North Carolina got in on a 4th down. BYU got in on a 4th down. Those are the ones that I just remember off the top of my head. I think Marshall had 1 or 2 3rd down touchdowns, right? So you've got to make some stops. You got to be able to capitalize. But here's why Notre Dame's defense has been able to keep the points down is because, yes, they're not good at stopping teams in the red zone. But here's the reality of it. They are, as I'm going to – let me just pull up the numbers here. To look at total attempts in the red zone. Notre Dame ranks this year, they've allowed 17 trips into the red zone, which ranks 14th in the nation and fewest red zone trips allowed. So the key is they don't let teams get into the red zone very often. And when they do, they score. Right? Yeah. So the key here is keep them out of the red zone. But then if you can get a stop or 2 in the red zone in this game, Ryan, against a team that's not really good at scoring in the red zone, then you can have some success. That's going to be a big part of this game. Big part of this game is do what you've done all year on defense. Keep the points down. You do that, got a shot to win.
It's wild that the point per game number and the yard per game number for Notre Dame is where it is, Brian, when you consider that they are so bad in the red zone and they have only forced 3 turnovers all year too. When you put those things together, usually I would look at those numbers and be like, oh, Notre Dame's defense is bad. And they're not. Yes. They're really not. Yes. They're not.
You'd think they're giving up close to 30 yards a game, 30 points a game, Ryan. I mean, you really 100%.
Would. Yeah.
No, you really
would. Which tells me that they are fundamentally doing a good job. It's just in a couple of the areas that usually dictate success defensively, they are falling short. And despite that, they are outplaying in other areas, which is interesting. It's just kind of interesting to see. But I think, again, Brian, when I watch Syracuse, I think methodical offense that wants to control the ball. They want to run the football, and they want to be efficient in the passing game. This is a game where if you don't shoot yourselves in the foot defensively for Notre Dame, I do think they have the advantage because Notre Dame, I don't think that they haven't really given up a ton of explosive plays outside of a couple coverage busts and, one long run last week against UNLV, which was just absolutely ridiculous on that 68-yarder. But if Notre Dame doesn't shoot themselves in the foot, I think they're going to be fine. They're going to be fine in this matchup because there's nothing about Syracuse that necessarily scares me big play-wise. If you're in the wrong gap, can Sean Tucker house one from distance? For sure. Can. Can Arondé Gadsden create an explosive play? Yes. Can Garrett Schrader break your back on 3rd and 8 and run for 15 yards as a scrambler? They can. But if Notre Dame plays fundamentally, I'm not worried about them creating explosive plays because they haven't been that type of team this year. They've been a team that is going to do the small things well, keep you on schedule, keep them just in that mindset, I think that plays into Notre Dame's advantage because they have been a team that has not really shot themselves in the foot from the 20 to the 20. It's just inside the 20, that's when they give up points, right? Like that's kind of been the stickler to Notre Dame. So if you just keep Syracuse what they are offensively and you continue to play your game and stay true to your fundamentals, I think Notre Dame has the advantage here. I do. I wouldn't say it's not close, but I think that Notre Dame, I feel pretty confident that Notre Dame is going to have a good defensive showing in this game as long as they don't allow Syracuse to be something that they aren't. Don't let a bunch of explosive plays because that's not how they win football games.
That's right. That's right. So, Ryan, that's going to do it for this part of the show. We're going to go to the mailbag next. We already have some questions in there. We have some good questions in there today. We'll get to those. But before we do, remember to hit that like button, everybody. Hit that subscribe smash the like button, hit the subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. If you're listening via podcast, please give us a 5-star review. And don't forget to sign up for the CFB or to subscribe to the CFB Nation podcast as well. And of course, as always, sign up for the message boards at irishbreakdown.com. So Ryan, it is mailbag time. We have a couple super chats here, and there's one for sure I definitely want to get to here. David Prevo has a super sticker. Thank you, David, very, very much for that. Michael S. has brought up a question that we get on the message board, and I want to address this again because I've addressed it before. Michael S. says, Brian, why don't you ask questions at Marcus Freeman or other coaches' press conferences? It seems most of the questions are softballs. Nobody holds coaches accountable or informative at these conferences. First of all, I've asked several questions of Marcus Freeman this year. I've tried to ask last couple, didn't get raised because I'm not there, and the people that are there should always get first dibs on that. I'm not complaining at all. I don't think they're purposely not asking me. It's just there's only a certain amount of time, and they give the questions to the people that are in attendance. Sean Stiers has asked several questions. He asks questions at every press conference. But here's the thing. People want us to go there and act like fans and just rip them and say, oh, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And that's just not how it works. A couple things you have to understand. Number one, what do you think they're going to say, right? And then Michael followed up with a comment where he said, I'm not saying to ask insulting questions, but to ask for explanations why certain obvious things aren't or are happening, i.e. why is Notre Dame one of the worst red zone teams on both offense and defense? That question got asked. That question got asked of Marcus Freeman on Monday. It's been asked in the past. It got asked of Al Golden last night, and got asked of Tommy Rees last night. It got asked of Al Golden last night, I believe. That was also one of the questions that he's been asked. People ask those questions all the time. It's like if we don't come out and say, what the freaking heck are you guys doing? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Tommy Rees has been asked about why isn't Chris Tyree used more? He's been asked about Braden Lindsey. He's been asked about the run game. Why aren't there bigger plays in the run game? Al Gold's been asked about certain things that when they weren't getting pressure on the quarterback, when they were giving up big plays, he's asked about what's resulting in the big plays. Marcus Freeman gets asked about those things. Like these questions are getting asked. We're just not going to go in there in a confrontational manner and go at them for a number of reasons. Number one is I do think it's unprofessional to go at a coach that way. Now, I believe you can go back at a coach. If you ask a respectful question and the coach comes at you and you feel you're in a position to go back at him, you can. I had that happen to me one time with Brian Kelly. I didn't go back at him because I wasn't in a position to do that. I was new on the beat and I was an employee, which meant if I did, my boss could have fired me. Now, I'd have no problem going back at a coach if he came at me that way. Number one. Number two, it's just there's a certain level of etiquette, I believe, that goes into this. You can ask a tough question without it being an attacking question. But all these things that people say, why aren't you asked this? I think I've yet to see a question at somebody say something like, well, why haven't you asked this? When in reality, those questions have been asked. Somebody even asked what I thought was kind of a ridiculous question of, do you regret not starting Drew Pine at the beginning of the year? Remember when he was good for 2 games? Because after 2 games, it was you guys are idiots for not starting him day one. And now it's this kid's a bum. He shouldn't even be second string. It's kind of funny how that goes, right? But Marcus Freeman was directly asked that, right? Do you think it was a mistake? Now, I didn't agree with the question. I agree with the premise, but hey, you know what? It's a tough question. And he answered it. So all the things that people have asked that think should be asked are getting asked. And you say, well, I don't like the answers. Oh, okay. So, do you want us to keep hammering him until he gives us the answer we want to hear? That's not how press conferences work, number one. Here's the second bigger picture thing you have to understand about Notre Dame. Notre Dame, since I've been on the beat, but especially last 4 or 5 years, has taken more and more and more access away from the media. Even things like my wife she shoots photography for games. They don't let them get as close to the team anymore coming out of the tunnel. They don't even let them walk into the tunnel anymore and take shots. They're not allowed to do post-game videos on the field anymore, as we got notice of that. We don't get to go to practice at all, right? We get to we go to 2 full practices in fall camp, right? One of them was non-padded, right? Didn't have pads on. We don't go to any practice during the season. Notre Dame is producing more and more of their own content, which is where all this is going. And they're limiting access more and more and more to things that you do so they can push everything. Notre Dame eventually wants to have their own channel, and then basically everything kind of goes through them, through that. That's what they're working towards, in my opinion. And so some of the sites are geared towards, they need the access to be successful. And that's not a criticism, that's an observation. If they don't get access to the team, they don't have as much content opportunities, which hurts their business. So if you go in there and start attacking, guess what? You don't get called on at the next press conference. You could potentially lose your access at some point in time, or most likely what they would do is they would just punish all of us and take away some of our access if you do it in an unprofessional manner. I'm not saying asking tough questions. I'm not saying Notre Dame would take away our access if we asked tough questions. I think some tough questions are asked. But again, the job of the media is to ask questions, to write articles, right? That's what the job of the media is at these press conferences. If you think we're going to be able to go out there and hammer Marcus Freeman and finally get him to admit what? What do you want him to admit? Look, man, Tommy Rees stinks. I can't believe I hired this. What are you going to want him to say? And then if he were to say, wait, Tommy's not doing a good enough job. I can't believe he threw his offensive coordinator under the bus, right? So I think Coach Freeman has gone too far in his defenses of his coaches. But I would rather him do that than throw them under the bus the way that the previous coach would do at times, if it meant protecting himself. So you're just not going to get what you think you're going to get. What we do is we're going to come here and hold them accountable this way, because nothing's going to change by me going into a press conference and getting into a fight. Because you know what happens? I look like the a-hole. And Driscoll just picking a fight with Coach Freeman. What's that all about? You know what I mean? Like, why is he going at Tommy Rees? He's got a practice to wear. He's got film to go wear. What's Driscoll going at him like that for? And I think they'd be right. So I already know what Tommy Rees is going to say to every single question he's going to get asked. And so what I can keep picking at him to try to piss him off, but what would that accomplish? That just make me look like an a-hole, right? I already have that problem. You know what I mean? I don't need to do it by picking a fight with the coaches, right? It does Tim Priester no good to go there and pick a fight with a coach, right? It does us no good to do that. And that's the only way we're ever going to get the questions answered that you want addressed. And even then, it's probably not going to happen. So I understand the frustration, but this is what we do every single day. This is why we have daily shows. We're going to point out this is what's good, this is what's not good. And we form opinion. We shape opinion. We have people that will argue things and it's not, I won't say that. We don't form opinions as much as people think we do. We give voice to a lot of the frustrating opinions, and then we can help explain to people what they're seeing. I don't like this, but I'm not quite sure the problem. And then you come to our channel and we break it down for you. That's where the frustration comes. You know how you want to make a difference with the Notre Dame football team is when they're not putting a good product in the field. It's not by asking Marcus Freeman tough questions. It's by the stands not being full and people not paying the money to go to the games. And people not giving money and donors and boosters and stuff like that. That's the only way that anything's going to change in Notre Dame. The only thing that would happen if we were to ask a tough question and get them on the ropes is it would maybe make us feel better about ourselves. And that's not our job. That should not be the objective. It's not. It's to tell a story, and you hold people accountable by what? I mean, I think we do a pretty darn good job of holding Notre Dame accountable. I do, right? But we're going to be much more effective doing that here than we will by trying to pick a fight with Marcus Freeman at a press conference or going at him or anything like that. So I understand why people feel the way that they do. I really do. Because as a fan, I kind of would feel the same way. But at the same time, people have jobs to do, and the other sites have built their model in a way where it does them no good to create an adversarial relationship with the coaching staff. We can survive that way because our model is differently, because I just knew that I wasn't going to be able to run a business where we weren't giving our honest opinion, which was going to piss coaches off, right? So we've built our model a little different, which is okay. It's not better, not worse. It's just different, right? There's no point of creating a new site that's just like everybody else's. We wanted to be different. Irish Breakdown. We're doing something different, so you have to understand that. But I just feel like I would just like people to understand that you're not going to get what you want from these press conferences. If you ask tough, all it's going to do is make you look bad, in my opinion, Ryan. And you may have a different opinion of that, but I just don't think that's the way to go. It may make fans feel better, but I just don't think that's the way to go. It's my thoughts.
Well, I think a lot of what people really like about the site too is, like, speaking to the message board aspect of it, right, Brian, is the intel that we can gather. And I mean, the only way you gather intel is to have relationships, right? And that type of interaction in a press conference would potentially fracture a relationship. I mean, we talked even about the fact that we were able to run Jeremiah Love's commitment publicly, right? I mean, that's something that we had to run by the Notre Dame department to make sure that they were okay
just
with
to
it.
find
You know
out
what I mean?
well, to make sure that it was good compliance-wise, right?
Right. Exactly. So to not step on anybody's toes or that type of thing, right? So this whole profession is based upon relationships that you develop. Like, that's how you get the information that you want. So, like, it's not just going to the press conferences and writing down the same monotonous answers that we know are coming. It's about, you were respectful to that person. So now behind the scenes, you are going to get a little tidbit that maybe others aren't going to get. Like, that's kind of that's the format. And that's how you get the intel that people love on the message board, for instance.
Right. But we will also sacrifice that if it definitely needs to be sacrificed. And we have done that this year. I promise you there are people that I could call over the summer that will not answer my phone right now. Promise you that. And that happened in the past too, because our job is always to bring you honest analysis. But there's just a right way and a wrong way of going about it. And getting into a public spat with a coach at a press conference is just not going to be – that's what's going to happen. Because if you say, well, that's not what I'm asking for. Well, what you're asking for, though, has already been done. Those questions get asked. Red zone offense and defense was a topic of conversation, which is why Sean Stiers wrote an article about it this week on our site with quotes from Marcus Freeman, because he was asked about it. And he explained it. Coach Golden talked about it yesterday. Coach Reese talked about it yesterday. Red zone has been brought up. They explained it. You can accept it or not. I think some of it's understandable. Some of it's true. I mean, Notre Dame's red zone offense looks a lot better last week if Michael Mayer doesn't drop a pass in the end zone and if Drew Pine throws a better ball to Tobias Merriweather. All of a sudden, we're looking at 50, you'd add 4. You got field goals from both of those, so you'd have 8 more points. You're talking about 52-21. It would have made it a little difference, right? So, that's just kind of where that stands. So I hope people understand that. There's a way to hold Notre Dame accountable, and it's not going to the press conference and saying, hey, why aren't you doing this? Because those questions are getting asked. They're just getting asked. And I think the one thing I'll say about the Notre Dame media is some of the press conferences are just like, they're just so monotonous, because it's like, how often do you want me to ask the same question over and over again? Right? I can't keep writing the same article. I know that this is an issue week after week after week, but I can't keep writing the same article week after week after week. I got to talk about something else. And that's the struggle. And sometimes they're boring, but I think when there's a very glaring issue, I think the Notre Dame media does a decent job of, someone brings it up. Sometimes people bring it up in a way where, like, oh, that was a bad way of asking it. He's not going to answer it the way you want him to answer it, but it gets brought up. Ian Johnson with a mailbag question. As a wide receiver, would you rather get 2 catches on deep shots or 6 catches on shorter routes, i.e. quantity or quality big plays? I think whatever. I mean, honestly, in that instance, it's just whatever's going to help us win and what my role is as a receiver. But
role
I think
is
guys
the
want to
biggest
score.
thing.
Yeah, I think scoring
role,
is the big key. I mean,
yeah. Everyone has their own individual role in an offense, right? So, like, I think, Ian, that really depends on what your particular role is. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you're get to 2 catches for 2 deep shots, it's probably a couple touchdowns that you were able to reel in, right? So that could be the difference between winning a football game and not winning a football game. So I guess the former in this conversation, but it really depends on what player we're talking about, what offensive structure.
If you're Braden Lindsey, you want him to have 2 catches on deep shots. If you're Avery Davis, if you're Jaden Thomas, give me 6 catches on shorter routes. Because what they're going to be asked to do is be Avery Davis was primarily a chain mover. Now, he'd be occasional deep shot. Sure, had a big touchdown against Purdue last year, a big touchdown against Clemson 2 years ago, but he's primarily a move the chains guy, right? Brady Lindsey, big play guy. So
and
it just depends on what your responsibility is.
And there's some players that create their explosive plays in different ways, right? So like A.J. Brown was not a deep shot guy, but what A.J. Brown could do is catch a 5-yard out and then break it for 25, because he's so good after the catch. So, I mean, even in that instance, it's like, a short catch for one player does not necessarily equal a short catch for another player, right? Just because you're catching it at a short distance doesn't mean that that's the exact number that you got on the route, right? So especially today's game with after the catch being so important, there are some players that's their average depth of target is shorter, but they create explosive plays just because that's who they are, right? So,
Tom Burke asks, if Notre Dame loses to either Syracuse or Clemson, do you feel Notre Dame should start to rebuild, giving younger players experience in the remaining 3 games? I'm really never an advocate of that, Ryan. I mean, you have a responsibility to coach your players to the best of their ability, give them the chance to go out and win that next game. So let's just say you say, okay, well, we lose to Clemson and Syracuse. Now this team is 4-5. I'm not playing the younger guys because you need to get bowl eligible. You need to do whatever it's going to take to win to get bowl eligible. If that means playing a younger guy because he gives you a better chance to win, then play him. And we've argued for that. We've argued for that with Tobias Merriweather. But you still have a responsibility to Isaiah Foskey, right? As long as he's still wanting to go out there and compete and practice and better his game and be part of the team, you owe it to him to continue to help build him to help his finished career off on a strong note, to help him get ready for the NFL draft, not bench him to play a young guy to build for next year. That's just not something I'm ever going to support unless there's a issue with a player. This guy's attitude is, I'm sick of it, so we're going to bench you. But that's more related to that player than your record or whatever else. Now, would I say that maybe does that advocate to I'm giving the different ways that Tom's question can be taken. Now, is there some merit to saying, okay, maybe you should get Josh Burnham 5 to 10 snaps a game as part of the rotation? Okay, that I might want to have a conversation about. Maybe, hey, let's get Nolan Ziegler and Jalen Snead on some of these special teams units to help them get some experience. That, Tom, you and I could have a conversation about. So if you're going to take the one extreme of, and I'm not saying Tom's doing this is just what some will go, just put all the young guys out there. I'm not going to support that. If you're saying maybe you start to work some of these young guys into the rotation more, okay, yeah, now we can have a conversation about that. Now if a guy's playing poorly, then I say make the move. But that should be the case whether you're winning or losing. If somebody gives you a better chance can somebody gives you a chance to play better, perform better at that position, then you make that move. Whether you're 4-5 or 9-0, which is I believe the number. They'd have 9 games after that stretch, correct? So it's a good question, Tom. It's a good question. Next question. We do have a super chat just popped up here from let's see, WDYT. Thank you for the super chat. Said, do you think the OC feels the urgency of positive outcomes and modifying course in order to 1, win current games, and 2, not lose recruits? You'd hope so, but I don't think so. Because again, it comes down to what does he think the issue is? If he thinks the issue is him, then he should modify things no matter what. If he doesn't think he's the issue, then he's not going to make a lot of changes, Ryan, to do something different. I mean, that's end of the day. That's what this whole thing boils down to is I don't think he believes he's the problem.
Right. Yeah.
You there?
It's the self-awareness that I have talked about. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. I thought we were having some disconnect there. My bad. I was just going to say that the self-awareness, I think, is lacking on the offensive side of the football. And the person that's calling the plays and making those decisions, I think that there is – to the question, WTYT, I think that there should always be urgency for those things, right? Especially with how important recruiting is in the world of college football. And to win games just in general, like those things are – why you coach, right? Like you coach to win football games, and how you win football games is by acquisition of talent and being able to develop that talent. Like that's how you win football games. And I do not think that there is an urgency to this team right now. I think that there is a belief in the process, but again, coming back to my original point early on in the podcast, if you're if your end result does not, if your results are not, if your process that you are currently using is not getting you to the end result that you want, you need to change your process, right? Like you need to change things. And until you do, it doesn't matter if you're urgent about your process because your process is at fault, like to begin with, right? So I think that's why we're kind of struggling right now.
Yep. Next question from Ash Trey, 1984. Why does Reese favor the players that are less talented? Diggs, Thomas, Salerno, Evans. Do you think it's because he wasn't as physically gifted as a player and he relates? I'm going to disagree with two of those. Logan Diggs is very talented. Yes. Mitchell Evans is talented. My issue with Mitchell Evans playing more has nothing to do with him not being talented. It's you've told other players that they're not playing because they missed playing time, they missed injury time. And then as soon as Mitchell comes back, you put him in the lineup. Now, if that was Michael Mayer, everybody would understand. But Mitchell Evans, I don't think should have earned that. But I think Tommy Reese likes him more than others. So he played him more. But it has nothing to do with Mitchell not being talented. He's much better than I thought he was going to be as a tight end earlier in his career, right? He's a good athlete. He's a high school quarterback. The other two, I somewhat disagree. I don't think Jaden Thomas lacks talent either. No. I think Jaden Thomas is being criminally misused.
Yeah.
That's an issue. So I think what it comes down to, Ashtrays, I think it's twofold. Number one, I think Tommy Reese flat out plays favorites. Flat out. Whether it's a guy he likes, whether it's a guy he recruited, whether it's a guy that fits the scheme that he wants to run as opposed to the scheme that's best used for this football team. The other part of it is like with Salerno and Jaden Thomas, Jaden's a pretty smart football player. He's picked up on the offense pretty well. He wants to play the guys who can execute all the volume of plays that he runs. I've been told by people that would know that the play sheets have grown quite a bit since last year. This is an area where I think Coach Kelly was able to kind of rein Tommy in a little bit because he was an offensive coach. Coach Freeman has given him, or maybe Jack Swarbrick has given him, full authority to do that, and he thinks he's an NFL coach, so he's going after these big, huge game plans, and you need guys that can run all of that. And Jaden Thomas and Matt Salerno can do that better than Deion Colsey and Tobias Merriweather, apparently. Yet those two guys are more talented, but they're not playing. It's got to be some kind of happy medium. But with Logan Diggs, I think it's more he likes Logan more and style of play-wise as opposed to him not being talented. I vehemently push back on the notion that Logan Diggs is less talented. I ranked Logan Diggs higher than Audric Estime coming out of high school, and I still think he's a better all-around back than Audric Estime. I've always felt that.
I mean, you can make the argument that he has the best all-around skill set of all the running backs on the roster right now.
We have made that argument on this show, Ryan. We both have made that argument. Correct.
And you're not. He's not the best. He's not potentially the best all-around player because he doesn't have talent. Like that doesn't make any sense, right? He's 6 foot.
He's not fast.
Right, he's not super fast, but he's 6 foot, 215 pounds, powerful, good hands,
great balance.
Like there's traits that he has that makes him really talented. Is he as fast as Chris Tyree? No, but you know who else isn't as fast as Chris Tyree? 98% of running backs in college football. Like that, it's not a detriment. That is just a difference of skill sets.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I think there's favorites, but I think it's for different reasons. And I don't think any of it is because a guy is less talented. I don't think that's ever the reason, to be honest with you. Let's go to the next question. Notre Dame 2164. First play of the game is a deep shot to Lorenzo Styles. He drops it again. Do you bench him for a certain amount of time or no? Boy, this is a tough one because he has dropped some big passes. I think for me, there'd be a lot more to it than this. And my concern with Lorenzo is the body language. The what I cannot answer about the body language is why. There's a lot of reasons why kids have bad body language. Lack of confidence in themselves, frustration with the coaches. They're thinking about leaving. They've got a girlfriend problem. They've got a parent being sick problem. You know, like Jamion Franklin, a former Notre Dame player, is at Duke, and I can't imagine what that kid's going through. He's playing for Duke. He's a part of their rotation, and yet he's got a mother who's battling cancer. Like that kid's going through stuff that most people aren't going through. that can weigh on a kid, And so I don't know what's going on with Lorenzo. I don't know if he's struggling academically. Again, I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying like there's so many different reasons as to why this could be the case. And I don't really know what the reason is. So it just would depend on what the problem is. If he had a great week of practice and he was locked in and all that, and he just drops a pass, then I'd say, okay, man, we got to do something to get you going. But if he's had like a sloppy week of practice and he's not locked in and whatever's causing the bad body language is seeping into his preparation for the game, and then he goes out and drops a pass, I'd probably pull him at least for a while. Give him a couple series off and say, hey, man, we need you. We need you to play. And then I'd put him back in there and throw him another ball pretty early and see what he does. But if he had a good week of practice and he just dropped the ball and his body language is good and he doesn't put his head down, that's the final piece I didn't mention is how does he react to it? If he comes back to the sideline, his head is down, he's kind of moping a little bit, that would lead to it as well. But he comes back, he's like, dang it, my bad, coach, get it to me again. Then I'd say, okay, let's get it to him again. Because he's too talented and he's too important to your offense in regard to being able to go out and beat USC and Clemson and Syracuse to just yank him off the field if he's still there and willing to help you. I think that's kind of the thing where I look at it and say it just depends on how the circumstances and how he responds and all that kind of stuff. Archer 452 says, when will Notre Dame complete 2023 schedule with dates for every game be released? Ohio State's just got released today, so I'm curious. So, Archer, Notre Dame's 2023 schedule is complete from an opponent standpoint. The problem is that there's 4 games on the schedule that currently are not given yet. So that is Duke, Louisville, NC State, and Pitt. So 4 of the 6, they play 6 ACC teams next year. So they play Duke, Louisville, North Carolina, all on the road, and then Pitt at home. They also play at Clemson at home against Wake Forest. So those 2 games are set. The other games are non-conference games, so those are more locked in. The reason that USC's same time every year, Stanford same time every year, they obviously set up the Navy, Tennessee State, Central Michigan, Ohio State schedules because those are non-conference games. Because the Notre Dame games with the ACC are partly due to ACC play, it just depends on the rest of those teams putting their schedules together and seeing where it's going to fall. So those are the things you look at and factor in why it's not set. So it's basically going to come down to when the ACC releases their complete schedule, then Notre Dame's will be finalized as well. Brent Smith asks, do you believe Pine's throwing accuracy was affected after he got his bell rung? To me, let's see here. I would say no. And I saw the conversation you're having earlier because you say, well, he missed a couple touchdown passes, but he missed those throws before he got dinged up too. I don't think his accuracy was necessarily affected by that because it didn't look any different. He was still missing those throws. So it's hard for me to say it was affected. Now, maybe it was affected, but again, it's hard for me to say that. And kind of, I don't know. Maybe you could say that and maybe it was, but it's just hard for me to say for sure because he was missing on those throws early. I mean, he's like 9 of 19 before that happened. Sports Cool 77. Do you guys feel that because of the success we have had blocking kicks, that Syracuse will be so concerned about protecting against the block that Joseph has a chance to break a big return? I think it's certainly possible, Sports Cool. That's a very good question and observation. Or maybe there's a shank punt that gives you like a 25-yard kick that gives you great field position. That's certainly part of it as well. You could see something like that happening. That could be part of what happens in this one. There's all types of different aspects of this that could certainly go into it. But that's why you're aggressive. I mean, I think that's a great observation because they've blocked like 4 kicks this season so far, and I think most of them have happened relatively recently. If I'm recalling correctly, I'm gonna pull this statistic up now, but I believe they've blocked 4 this year. I believe they're like tied for 3rd in the country. So there's like 2 teams tied at number 1, and then they're tied after that in blocked kicks. But I believe that a lot of the block kicks have happened recently. So if I'm going to go game by game, so they had 1 against Marshall, so that was early, and then 3 in the last 2 games. They had a block kick against Stanford and then 2 block kicks against UNLV. So 3 of the 4 have happened recently. So that's a big thing. And all of a sudden against against UNLV, you all of a sudden see them kind of rushing kicks off, and all of a sudden Brandon Joseph is getting shorter kicks that he's able to return for 5 to 8 yards. But the 5 to 8 yards combined with the shorter kicks is leading to you getting great field position. So yes, it's good, very good observation, and certainly something I think we could see on Saturday. Jason Rose says Notre Dame has faced 2 better quarterbacks than Schrader and Stroud and May, and more than held their own. Sure, but that doesn't mean just because they did that doesn't mean they could have an off game this week. It's just about being disciplined and executing. But I think Garrett Schrader presents a little bit of a unique challenge, in my opinion, because I would say he's a little bit more of a experienced, dynamic runner than May is. May's a scrambler. May is not a designed runner. Schrader is more of a designed runner. Stroud is not a runner at all. I mean, he's a pocket guy. Now, he did some really nice stuff out of the pocket, but he did it with his arm. He's not a runner. So they're just different players. I mean, Jaron Hall is a very good quarterback. They shut him down. Notre Dame has faced very good quarterbacks this year. Tanner McKee is a guy that some people think is going to be a future NFL quarterback. So they've played some pretty good quarterbacks this season. There's no question about that. David Prevost says, why haven't we seen any design pass plays that look to Mayer with all the focus on him at first option and pull that defense over to create opportunities for wide receivers? We have seen some of it, but not nearly enough, David. So the play against Stanford was similar to that. So they went 2-by-2 or 3-by-1 out of 12 personnel. I believe there was a tight end backside and Michael Mayer was play side. Then you had Tobias Merriweather in the slot, and you had, I think it was Braden Lindsey outside. But Tobias ran a post route. Michael Mayer ran kind of a backside sort of deep drag. I don't know if it was a seam that he leveled off because the guy stayed on top, or if he was purposely running on the guy's toes and then running on a drag to kind of occupy him. It could be either way. They're going to look very similar from an execution standpoint. So I don't know specifically what the call was, but it accomplishes the same thing. Run right at that guy's toes, eat him up. If he bails, then you look for the ball because you're going to be open behind the linebackers. If he sits on you, then there's a post route coming behind you. And that's what they ran, and they set it up. But to your point, I think that they have done some of that stuff, but the problem is they're just not, the quarterback's just not looking for him. There was stuff that they ran on Saturday where he looks left to Mayer and Braden Lindsey's wide open to the right. There's a play where Tobias was wide open opposite Michael Mayer. So it comes a point in time where you just got to tell the quarterback, don't throw it to him on this play. But then you kind of limit yourself but what if the coverage is such that he's going to get open on that play? It's going to eventually come down to teaching your quarterback to make the proper reads, and then the quarterback making the proper reads. But I do think there's more that they can do there, but it's not a lot more. There's things they can do for decoys to create big plays. I'd say maybe 4 or 5 times a game we should see more of that, but it's not like 20 times. But to your point, it's something that certainly could be effective and something that could help the offense if you can do more of that and where it's done in a noticeable fashion. Like, man, you really put teams in a pickle if you can do this with Mayer and then do this off of it. It could really hurt people. Wayne Miller says, listening while picking up my daughter, I meant there's a lot of things Notre Dame could do, the ifs, but do you think we will see changes on Saturday, Wayne? And this is a follow-up to your point earlier, and that's the thing is I don't know. I mean, 7 games in, honestly, Wayne, I'm not overly optimistic they're going to see a lot of changes. I don't think we're going to see Tommy Rees all of a sudden figure things out. Somebody had made a comment that, they were at practice and saw some different things. I've heard they do that stuff all the time. They practice that stuff all the time. That's the frustrating thing. From what I've been told by sources, they don't run a lot of the stuff that they practice. They practice a lot of stuff, and then they don't run it all. My thing is have less that you do in practice and be really good at it, and then find some counters off of it, So I'm not optimistic it's going to change because we just haven't seen it. I'm hopeful that it'll change. But to me, that's different than that and optimistic. I'm not optimistic it's going to change because we haven't seen it. I just hope that they do and hope that the light goes on. Because as I've said before, there's a reason I supported Tommy Rees coming into the season. And I hope that he recovers and bounces back and becomes a guy I think he's capable of being. But after 7 games, I'm not just going to assume what's going to happen. I'm going to say what I think needs to happen. And if he listens, great. If he doesn't, then he doesn't. I don't mean listens, but like he's not listening to us. But I mean just listens to the people around him, listens to his head, and humbles himself a little bit and says, boy, I got to make some changes. If he does that, then I think he'll be fine. And we will see those changes. I'm at the point now, Wayne, really, where I got to believe it. I mean, I got to see it to believe it. I'm not going to assume that it's happening. I just got to see it. I just got to see it. And if I see it, then great. We'll talk about it. But I gotta see it to believe it. Got a super chat here from McKay Rippey. Are y'all up for an IB meetup at Syracuse? So I'll be getting in town Friday night. Ryan will be getting in town Friday night is the plan. So it'll probably be too late to do anything on Friday. If you all do something like before the game, if you all decide to meet up somewhere on campus for the game and have like a tailgate, let us know. We'll definitely come by. It's kind of hard for me to organize something for an event like that where I'm just kind of coming in downtown the night before. Like bowl games is a little different because for bowl games, I usually come in town a few days before the game. This is a little bit different. So I won't be organizing anything, but if you all want to do something, feel free. I mean, go for it. That'd be a lot of fun. So just let me know and we'll come by. We'll definitely come by before the game for sure. So I would enjoy meeting more and more. I love meeting y'all, man. Every time it's always fun. We did meetups in Arizona back when I was at the previous place, met some people that I now consider friends, met them for the first time there and several people. We had great time in Arizona last year. Met some really cool people from all over the country. Met people, I think, from like Idaho or Montana, something last year, which is like, and then there's like people from Florida, people from Arizona, people from California, people from Illinois, and we all met in Phoenix, so I always enjoy those things. So if you guys organize something and let us know where you are, we'll swing by and we'll see you. Michael Hughes, thank you for the super chat, by the way. Michael Hughes says, is Tyree secretly banged up? When he has tried to get to the edge, he hasn't had the burst to get there in recent games. I don't agree with that. I don't know that they've tried to get him to the edge, to be honest with you, Michael. And a couple times they have. It's on plays where you're not running. You don't get to the edge like by just running as fast as you can. That's not really a thing that you do very often. You get to the edge on the second level. You go vertically and then bounce it up the outside. Like his touchdown run against Syracuse and Clemson in 2020, they were both up the sideline, but they started up the middle and then got through the first level, and then he bounced. So I don't think he's had those opportunities. But I've looked into this because I had the same question just because of like, how are they using him? Is there a reason why they stopped giving him the ball in the pass game? Is he banged up? And the answer is no. No, I don't. He's not injured. He's fine. It's just a choice. It's a coaching decision. Let's see here. Brent Smith, how would you characterize Drew Pline's play overall? Brent, two words, wildly erratic. That's it. I mean, when he's on, he's been pretty good. When he's off, he's been pretty bad. They need him to be more consistent. That's going to be the key. If they can find a way to get Drew more consistent and just tailor the offense, like here's what it is. I remember listening to I love watching I don't watch the NFL, but I still love watching the NFL films. They do such great work, especially when Steve Sable was alive. But they were covering like the year Tom Brady took over for Drew Bledsoe. I remember a conversation that he was having on the sideline with with Drew Bledsoe, who was hurt, but he was back and helping. And they were asking Tom Brady, like, what do you like? What are you comfortable with? What do you and I feel like I don't know if they're necessarily doing that at Notre Dame, but they're definitely not calling it to a way that Drew really likes, or finding what Drew really likes and not just what he likes, but what he's good at. And they're going to have to figure that out, honestly, because they need him to be better. And he's got to play better. So like, part of this is on Drew, right? Drew's got to play better. He's got to make a better ball to Tobias Merriweather. He can't throw it on the line. He's got to throw it soft and high. Let him go make that play. He can't just constantly lock in. I mean, look, does he need to get coached better? Yes, absolutely. Is the volume of what they're putting in keeping him from playing this potential? Yes, absolutely. Are there times where I'm like, dude, that's on you, Drew? Yes, absolutely. And so he's made some great throws. It's just the consistency of it. The throw to Jaden Thomas, really good throw. The throw to Tobias Merriweather against Stanford, great throw. He made two great seam throws against BYU. He made two great third down throws to Michael Mayer one against Carolina, one against BYU, where it's 3rd and 10. And he just puts that ball high and lets Mayer go get it. He's made some great throws, and then he's missed some really easy throws, like to Chris Tyree, going up the seam for a touchdown and should have been open for a touchdown, just missed them. So he's going to have to make those plays. And eventually he will. He eventually will. Next question from Holden Cotter. Let's see here. Let's get to this here real quick. Holden Cotter says, do you think the defense will right its problems as the year continues to go on, like it has in the past under new DCs, or do you think these issues will last season long? That's a really good question. In some ways, Holden, the defense is and will continue to get better. And part of the problem with the defense is they're not doing enough. Let's see. They're I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. They put so much volume in, and Golden asks so much of them that it hurt them. But that, as long as they continue to kind of stay on that course, eventually you get through the year and they start figuring things out more. What he wants, how he can use them. This is what this call means. This is what Coach Golden likes here. This is what Coach Golden wants here. Eventually, they figure it out, and they start making more plays. And I hope that's what we saw against UNLV. I hope that's it. I hope it wasn't just because they're really bad. I hope that's what it is. And so they'll figure some of those things out. However, there's also a notion of they put so much new stuff in every week that they'll never get to the level that they're capable of, because there's always new stuff that they're, could run the risk of not executing well. And so I think that helps. That would help if they would scale it down. Like, okay, we've put enough new stuff in, right? We don't need to keep adding a bunch of new stuff. Maybe that's already happened. I don't know if it has or hasn't. But I think they've gotten steadily better. I mean, again, we're ticked about the Syracuse game or Stanford game. They gave up 16 points. So I mean, the defense is giving you a chance to win every game. And so the problems are their problems. I mean, against Clemson and USC, you might give up more than what you've given up in those games. So hopefully they can continue to clean some things up and stay healthy. But I think over time, yes, I do think that some of that stuff will get better just because of more time in the system, learning it and executing it more. I do. Ed3 with a super chat. Thank you, Ed, for that very, very, very much. So that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. I want to thank you all for being a part of our show today. Thank you all very much for the questions and the different conversations in those different aspects. And so I want to thank you very much for that. Tonight, we have another IB Nation Sports Talk show with Vince D'Addario and Sean Stiers, obviously our host, but Vince will be with him. I believe they're doing the mailbag again tonight. Tomorrow, Ryan and I'll be back to talk keys to victory. So we'll dive deeper into detail about what Notre Dame can and should do to beat Syracuse and what they'll have to defend against. Then, of course, tomorrow night, we'll have another IB Nation Sports Talk show. Friday, we will have our prediction show. And then, of course, Saturday, Sean and Vince will have the IB Nation Countdown to kickoff show at 10 to noon. And then, of course, Ryan and I will both be at the game on Saturday. And we'll have a post-game show afterwards. So hit that like button, everybody. Hit that subscribe button. Hit that notification bell. Share this podcast. Check out all the cool stuff we have below. Built Bar, merch stuff, all that good stuff. And, of course, sign up for the message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com, boards.irishbreakdown.com. Thanks for joining us so much, everybody. Have a great day. And thank you for being with us on the Irish Breakdown podcast.